Picture a longship cutting through the cold, heavy mist of the North Sea, its dragon-headed prow slicing the waves as rowers chant in rhythm, their breath visible in the frigid air. This is the iconic image of the Vikings that has been burned into our minds through stories, films, and legends. We've been told they were ruthless raiders, savage warriors who wore horned helmets and lived only for plunder and battle. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about the Vikings is wrong? That the popular image we hold is not just incomplete but deeply misleading? For centuries, the Vikings have been shrouded in myth and misunderstanding. Their true story is far richer, more complex, and more surprising than you could ever imagine. These were not just warriors, they were explorers who reached North America 500 years before Columbus, traders who established routes from Baghdad to Greenland, poets, lawmakers, and innovators whose legacy stretches far beyond the battlefield. The Vikings left behind clues hidden in sagas, buried in artifacts, and encoded in runestones that tell a story much grander than the one we've been taught. Today, we're setting the record straight. We're going to uncover 30 jaw-dropping secrets from the Viking Age revelations that will challenge what you thought you knew and open your eyes to a world of intrigue, ingenuity, and adventure. From their mysterious navigation techniques to their surprising views on gender, from the truth about their helmets to the real reasons they set sail in the first place, we're diving deep into the untold history of these fascinating people. So settle in, because by the end of this journey, the Vikings will never look the same to you again. Let's kick things off with a secret so fundamental it might just shatter your entire image of a Viking warrior. They never ever wore horned helmets, not into battle, not during a raid, not even at a feast. The iconic headgear we see in every cartoon and old movie is a complete fabrication. So where did this powerful myth come from? The answer lies not in a Viking burial mound, but in the imagination of 19th century artists and composers. During the Romantic era, there was a huge resurgence of interest in ancient Germanic and Norse legends. When Richard Wagner's epic opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung, premiered, the costume designer Carl Emil Doppler created horned helmets for the Viking-like characters to make them look more imposing and primitive for the stage. This dramatic, theatrical look was quickly adopted by painters and illustrators of the time, and a pop culture legend was born, completely divorced from historical reality. The truth, as always, is far more fascinating because it's rooted in brutal practicality. Imagine for a moment trying to fight your way onto an enemy ship with a sword and shield. Now imagine doing it with two large, cumbersome horns sticking out of your head. Not only would they be incredibly heavy and throw off your balance, but in the thick of a close-quarters melee, an opponent could easily grab a horn to yank you off your feet or deflect your own weapon right back into your face. A horned helmet would be a deadly liability, not an advantage. So what did a real Viking helmet look like? The archaeological evidence is sparse. Iron corrodes over centuries, but the most famous and complete example is the German Boo helmet found in a burial mound in Norway. It's a simple, stark, and brilliantly functional piece of equipment. It's made of iron and designed in the Spangenhelm style, with a rounded cap forged from several plates held together with bands and a simple guard to protect the nose and eyes. There are no horns, no wings, no elaborate decorations for battle. It was about protection and nothing more. Hollywood, of course, latched onto the horned myth because it's visually striking and instantly recognizable. It's a powerful shorthand that says Viking to an audience in a single glance. But why does correcting this misconception matter beyond just historical pedantry? It matters because it changes how we see the Vikings themselves. The horned helmet represents a fantasy, a caricature of a mindless barbarian. The real, practical helmet reveals them as they were, pragmatic, intelligent warriors who valued function over form when their lives were on the line. They were sophisticated enough to understand what worked in combat and what was a theatrical death trap. Letting go of the horned helmet is the first step toward seeing the Vikings not as mythic brutes, but as real, complex people. And that opens the door to understanding all the other incredible secrets they left behind. And if the image of a hornless warrior challenges one stereotype, the next discovery shatters an even bigger one. For generations, we've accepted a very clear picture of Viking society. Men were the warriors, the explorers, the chieftains, while women stayed behind to manage the home and farm. It was a tidy division of labor that seemed to make perfect historical sense. But in 2017, a team of researchers decided to re-examine one of the most famous Viking warrior graves ever discovered. And in doing so, they turned our entire understanding of gender and power in the Viking Age completely upside down. The grave was found in the Swedish trading town of Birka, a major economic hub during the 9th and 10th centuries. This wasn't just any burial, it was a high-status warrior's grave, lavishly furnished with everything a distinguished fighter would need for the afterlife. The body was surrounded by an axe, a sword, a spear, protective armor, a shield, and even 2 horses. Most tellingly, the remains were buried with a full set of board game pieces, an item archaeologists interpret as a symbol of a high-ranking military leader, someone skilled in the art of war strategy. For over a century, since its excavation in the late 1800s, everyone simply assumed this was the grave of a man. It fit the narrative perfectly. Then, advanced DNA analysis was applied to the skeletal remains. The results were unequivocal and sent shockwaves through the historical community. The individual buried with all the honors of a supreme military commander was without a doubt biologically female. This wasn't just an outlier. This was a high-status individual, a strategist, given a burial with full martial honors that was reserved for the most esteemed members of society. The Birka warrior forces us to reread the old Norse sagas and historical accounts with new eyes. We've always had these incredible stories of shieldmaidens, women who chose the path of the warrior. The Icelandic sagas, written down later but based on older oral traditions, are filled with them. Figures like Lagertha, the legendary shield maiden who fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, or Herva, who famously demanded the cursed sword Tyrfing from her father's grave. Historians have long debated whether these women were mythological archetypes, poetic devices, or based on real people. The discovery at Birka provides powerful, physical evidence that women could and did occupy these roles. They weren't just characters in a story, they were a reality. This revelation opens up a much more complex and fascinating view of Viking society. While it's unlikely that every woman was a warrior, just as not every man was, the evidence suggests their society had a more flexible concept of gender than we once believed. A woman's value wasn't solely tied to the domestic sphere. She could inherit property, request a divorce, and as we now know, achieve the highest military status. Reconstructions of female warriors based on finds like these show them equipped identically to their male counterparts, in chainmail with round shields, swords, and axes, ready for the brutal realities of combat. They were judged not by their gender, but by their skill, courage, and accomplishments. This changes everything. It moves us from a simplistic view of Vikings as a hyper-masculine warrior culture to a far more interesting and nuanced society where individual capability could, in some cases, transcend traditional gender expectations. The Birka warrior isn't an anomaly. She's a key that unlocks a secret door to a world far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. But if the Birka warrior redefines who the Vikings were, the next secret redefines the very scale of their world. We've all been taught that Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, bravely sailing into the unknown. It's a foundational story, but it's not the whole story because the Vikings beat him to it by nearly 500 years. And we're not talking about a lost ship or a few scattered artifacts. We have the remains of an entire Viking settlement to prove it. That proof lies at a place called Elance Aux Meadows on the very northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. Discovered in 1960 by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad, this site is the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America outside of Greenland. And it is unequivocally Viking. The remains of 8 sturdy turf-built structures stand as silent testimony to their presence. 3 dwellings, a forge, and 4 workshops, all matching the architectural style found in Iceland and Greenland from the same period. But the buildings alone weren't enough to seal the deal. It was the artifacts uncovered within them that erased all doubt. A bronze cloak pin, a stone oil lamp, a small ring-headed pin made of bronze, and most importantly, the iron rivets used in their ship repair, all of them were unmistakably Norse. There was even a spindle whorl used for spinning wool, which pointed directly to the presence of women, suggesting this wasn't just an exploratory landing party, but a short-lived attempt at a colony. Through advanced radiocarbon dating, we now know this settlement was occupied around the year 1000, a full 5 centuries before Columbus's famous voyages. So how did they get there? Their journey was the culmination of a stepping stone expansion across the North Atlantic. It started with the settlement of Iceland in the late 9th century. From there, an outlaw named Eric the Red, seeking a new life, sailed further west and discovered a massive, icy landmass. In a brilliant bit of marketing, he named it Greenland to attract settlers. From their new foothold in Greenland, the Vikings pushed further west, eventually sighting the coasts of what they called Helluland Land of Stone Slabs, likely Baffin Island, Markland Forest Land, likely Labrador, and finally Vinland. The name Vinland, meaning wine land, comes from the sagas which describe finding wild grapes and plentiful resources there. Elance Aux Meadows itself wasn't necessarily Vinland, but rather a base camp for further exploration into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where the more temperate conditions described in the sagas would have been found. This leads to the biggest question: if they made it and even established a foothold, why didn't they stay? Why didn't the Viking Age become the Viking American Age? The answer lies in a combination of immense challenge and a simple lack of incentive. The distance from Greenland and Iceland was staggering, a dangerous open ocean voyage of nearly 2,000 miles that would have taken weeks. The local indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelings, were initially involved in trade, but relations quickly deteriorated into violent conflict. The Vikings, used to raiding undefended monasteries, were now facing determined, organized resistance from people who knew the land infinitely better than they did. Furthermore, the climate began to cool during the Little Ice Age, making the long voyages even more perilous and isolating the Greenland settlements, which eventually died out themselves. Crucially, unlike later European explorers, the Vikings weren't searching for a new route to the spice-rich Indies. They had found what they needed in Europe: wealth, goods, and lands to settle. North America was simply too far, too dangerous, and ultimately not valuable enough to justify the colossal effort required to maintain a permanent colony. This is what makes the Viking achievement so different from Columbus's. Columbus's voyages were funded by a powerful, unified Spanish crown with the explicit goal of establishing a permanent trade route and claiming new territories for the empire. His discovery was immediately followed by a wave of colonization that irrevocably changed the world. The Viking exploration of North America, by contrast, was a testament to individual daring and incredible seafaring skill. It was a dead end in history, a brilliant flash of exploration that flickered out. But that doesn't make it any less revolutionary. It rewrites our timeline of global exploration, proving that the first European footfalls on American soil were not in the 15th century, but in the 11th, worn by the boots of a Viking. But if their voyages redefined the map, their personal habits would completely redefine the image of the Viking individual. Forget the grimy, blood-soaked barbarian caked in mud and gore. The reality is, a Viking would have been one of the cleanest, most well-groomed people you could have met in early medieval Europe. This obsession with hygiene is one of their most startling secrets, completely upending the filthy savage stereotype. Archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture of a culture that valued personal presentation. Viking graves, from the humblest farm to the most lavish chieftain's burial, consistently contain a personal grooming kit. These weren't crude implements, they were finely crafted tools for daily use. Combs are among the most common finds, meticulously carved from antler or bone. They were so valued that they were often carried on the person, sometimes in a protective case. Alongside these combs, we find ear cleaners, tweezers for plucking eyebrows and managing facial hair, and even small razors. These items tell a story of a people who took pride in their appearance, who cared about the details of their grooming in a way we typically associate with much later periods. Their bathing rituals were particularly extraordinary for the time. Historical accounts, including those from often critical foreign observers, consistently note that Vikings bathed at least once a week, a frequency that was practically unheard of in many parts of 9th and 10th century Europe. In England, for instance, many Christian monks who wrote about the Viking raids did so with a mix of terror and bewildered admiration for their cleanliness. One Arab diplomat and traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Viking traders on the Volga River, provided one of the most detailed outsider accounts. While he found many of their customs strange and off-putting, he specifically noted their meticulous hygiene. He described how they washed their faces and heads every day in a communal basin of water, a practice he viewed as excessively communal but undeniably clean. Perhaps their most fascinating grooming habit was their use of soap for a very specific purpose, to bleach their hair. Both men and women are believed to have used a strong, lye-based soap that had a natural bleaching effect. This would lighten their hair, often to a striking blonde or reddish tone, which was highly prized in their culture. This practice was so widespread that it even influenced the names used by other cultures to describe them. In many parts of the world, they weren't even called Vikings, they were the Roos, a name derived from an Old Norse term meaning the men who row. But some linguists argue it could also be linked to the Finnish word for Sweden, ruotsi, which itself may come from a term meaning the men of the rowing way. However, in the Arabic world, traders encountering these fair-haired, cleansed traders simply referred to them as the sakaliba, a word often used for fair-haired or light-skinned people of Northern Europe. Their bleached hair became a defining characteristic, a marker of their identity that was noticed thousands of miles from home. This emphasis on cleanliness wasn't just about vanity, it was deeply practical and woven into their social and spiritual beliefs. In a world before germ theory, they may not have understood the science, but they understood the results. Good hygiene meant better health, fewer parasites, and a higher chance of surviving wounds without infection, a critical advantage for warriors and explorers. It was also tied to their concept of honor and hospitality. Presenting yourself as clean and well-kept was a sign of respect to both your guests and your host. Their weekly bath, often taken on a Saturday, became so ingrained that it left a linguistic footprint centuries later. The English word for the weekend day, Saturday, is derived from the Roman god Saturn. But in the Scandinavian languages, the day is called lørdag in Norwegian and Danish, and lørdag in Swedish, a word that literally translates to washing day, a direct echo of a 1,000-year-old routine. This commitment to grooming forces us to see the Viking world not as a dark, muddy slog, but as a culture with a surprising concern for comfort, health, and social grace, proving that civilization and a fierce warrior spirit could and did go hand in hand. Yet for all their grooming and cleanliness, the Vikings faced a navigational challenge that would have terrified any sailor of their era, crossing thousands of miles of open, empty ocean without a magnetic compass. Under a cloudless sky, they could read the sun and stars, but the North Atlantic is a place of perpetual mist, dense fog, and stormy overcast. So how did they possibly find their way to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America without constantly getting lost at sea? The answer lies in a combination of incredible skill, meticulous observation, and a remarkable piece of technology that sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel, a magical crystal called a sunstone. Viking sagas, those epic tales passed down through generations, make fleeting but fascinating references to these tools. One saga describes King Olaf holding up a mysterious solarstein or sunstone to the sky to locate the sun on a cloudy day and verify the position of a hidden ship. For centuries, historians dismissed this as pure legend, a poetic device with no basis in reality. But in the late 1960s, a Danish archaeologist named Thorkild Ramsku proposed a revolutionary theory. He suggested the sunstone wasn't magic at all, but a perfectly real and functional mineral, a crystal of cordierite or calcite. These are transparent crystals that possess a unique optical property known as birefringence. When you look through them and rotate them, the light passing through the crystal splits into two beams. On a cloudy day, the human eye cannot detect the faint, polarized light ringing the sun, but the crystal can. By holding the stone up to the sky and rotating it until the two beams of light within it are of equal intensity, a navigator can pinpoint the exact position of the sun, even when it is completely invisible behind the clouds. It effectively turns the entire sky into a giant compass. Of course, knowing where the sun is only gives you an east-west line. To truly navigate, you need a full reference point. This is where another incredible Viking innovation comes into play, the sun compass. While no complete wooden sun compass has ever been found, wood decays over centuries. Archaeologists did discover a single, stunning artifact that proves its existence. During an excavation of a Norse monastery in Greenland, a fragment of a wooden disc was unearthed. This wasn't just any piece of wood. It had a series of precise notches carved around its edge and a hole in the center, perfectly matching the description of a bearing dial. The theory is that a navigator would have a central, removable gnomon, a small pin that casts a shadow. As the sun moved across the sky throughout the day, the shadow cast by this pin would shorten and lengthen. By marking the tip of that shadow at different times, a navigator could create a series of arcs on the dial. On subsequent days, even with variable weather, they could estimate the time of day and their latitude by comparing the new shadows to these pre-marked curves. Now imagine a skilled navigator, a leithiaumaður or pathfinder, on the deck of a longship. The sky is a uniform sheet of gray, the horizon non-existent. He reaches for his sunstone, a lump of clear calcite, and holds it aloft, slowly rotating it until the light within it aligns. He now knows the azimuth of the hidden sun. He then consults his sun compass, a wooden disc marked with the shadow curves for that particular time of year and their intended latitude. By combining these two tools, he can set a course and maintain it for days. This wasn't just guesswork. It was a sophisticated system of celestial navigation that allowed them to traverse the ocean with a confidence that seems almost superhuman to us today. But is this just a compelling modern theory, or did it actually work? This is where the field of experimental archaeology takes center stage. Modern sailors and historians have put these ancient techniques to the test in spectacular fashion. In 1984, a crew sailed a reconstructed Viking ship, the Saga Sigla, from Norway to Newfoundland using only a replica sun compass and a cordierite sunstone. They reported that the sunstone was effective more than 90% of the time, even under thick cloud cover. A more recent and rigorous experiment was conducted in 2011 by a team of Hungarian researchers. They took a modern yacht into the Arctic Ocean and during overcast conditions had participants use a calcite sunstone to determine the sun's position. They then checked their readings with a modern polarized GPS instrument. The results were astounding. The readings from the ancient sunstone technique were accurate to within a single degree. This scientific validation transformed the sunstone from a mythic legend into a proven, functional tool of Viking Age science. This revelation completely changes our perception of the Viking mind. We often picture them as fierce but simple warriors, driven by brute force and a thirst for plunder. Their navigation technology reveals the opposite. They were meticulous scientists of their environment, master observers of natural phenomena, and brilliant engineers who harnessed the properties of light itself to conquer the greatest wilderness on Earth, the open ocean. They didn't just stumble upon new lands by accident. They sailed there with purpose, guided by a technology so advanced it would take the rest of Europe centuries to catch up. Their sunstone wasn't magic, it was physics, and that understanding of the natural world was the true secret behind their legendary voyages. This mastery of the sea and their meticulous nature leads us directly to another of their great intellectual achievements, one that is often overshadowed by their reputation for violence. We think of them as an oral culture, passing down sagas around the fire, but the Vikings absolutely had a written language. It wasn't used for writing books or keeping elaborate court records. Instead, they used a powerfully elegant and angular alphabet carved into the very bones of their world. This was the runic alphabet, and understanding how they used it reveals a society deeply concerned with memory, identity, and even the mystical. Their writing system is known as the Younger Futhark, and it was a stunningly efficient piece of design. Unlike our 26-letter alphabet, the Younger Futhark condensed the older, more complex Germanic runic system into just 16 characters. This wasn't a step backward, it was a brilliant adaptation. Each character had to represent multiple sounds. For instance, the rune for the sound B also stood for P, and the rune for T could also mean D or TH. This required the reader to understand the context of the word, making runes a sort of linguistic shorthand that was perfect for short, impactful inscriptions. They were carved with a knife or a chisel into durable materials: wood, bone, antler, metal, and most famously, stone. The very act of writing was a physical, permanent act of engraving, not the swift flow of ink on parchment. The most dramatic examples of this are the rune stones, massive standing stones that dot the Scandinavian landscape by the thousands. These were not gravestones in the way we think of them today. They were powerful public monuments, often placed along well-traveled roads or near important gathering places. Their primary purpose was to memorialize the dead, but they did so in a way that tells us exactly what Viking society valued most. A typical inscription doesn't just say, "Here lies Eric." It proclaims, "Björn raised this stone in memory of Thorir, his brother, a very good yeoman. He died in the north in Viking." In just a few lines, we learn about family bonds, social status, a profession, and the cause of death. Death as a Viking on an expedition was something to be proudly remembered and announced to the world. These stones are frozen moments of biography, legal documents establishing inheritance, and statements of social standing, all carved in granite for the entire community to see. But runes were not only for grand monuments. They appear on the most intimate and everyday objects, showing that literacy, at least of a functional kind, was surprisingly widespread. A wooden stick found in Bergen, Norway, carries a simple, charming message, "Jai," that says you should go home. It's a 1,000-year-old note, perhaps from a wife to a husband spending too much time at the tavern. Weapons were often given names like Wave Flame or Serpent of Blood, using runes believed to imbue the blade with spirit and power. Women's tools were not excluded. A bone comb might be inscribed with the word comb, not as a label but as a personal mark of ownership or a charm to keep it from breaking. This brings us to the most fascinating aspect of runes, their connection to magic. The very word rune itself is shrouded in mystery, believed to be related to the Old Norse word run, meaning secret or whisper. In the Viking mind, writing was not a neutral act, it was a process that channeled hidden forces. Individual runes were thought to hold specific powers. The rune Thurs Theorisas, representing a giant or a thorn, could be carved to curse an enemy, while Olga Alges, which looks like a person with arms upraised, was a symbol of protection and could be drawn on a shield before battle. The most powerful magical inscriptions are the so-called curse stones or cryptic runic codes, like the intriguing Galdrastafir or magical staves, which are complex bind runes created by combining several runic letters into a single symbol of immense power. To write something down was to make it permanently true, to fix a fate or a memory in place for all time. So why, with this powerful tool, did they never develop a culture of lengthy texts? Why no Viking libraries? The answer is deeply practical and cultural. Their society was built on oral tradition. The epic sagas, the laws, the histories, these were the domain of the living voice of the storyteller and the law speaker who held everything in his memory. Writing something down on perishable materials like vellum, which was used in the Christian monasteries they raided, required a sedentary, institutional culture like the church, with scriptoriums and dedicated scribes. The Viking world was one of movement, of action. Runes were the perfect technology for this world, durable, portable, and immediate. They were for declarations, not discussions, for names, not narratives, for spells, not sermons. This unique approach to writing shows us a culture that valued the lasting impact of a single, well-carved sentence over the fleeting nature of 1,000 written pages, proving that sometimes the most powerful stories are the shortest ones. Their legendary voyages across the stormy North Atlantic were a testament to their navigational genius, but their ambition didn't stop at the edge of the Western world. While some Vikings were sailing west into the unknown, others were embarking on an equally perilous journey in the opposite direction, forging commercial arteries that stretched all the way to the glittering capitals of the Islamic world. This vast Eastern trade network is one of the Viking Age's best-kept secrets, revealing them not as mere raiders, but as sophisticated international merchants on a scale that would be impressive even today. The route to the east was not by sea, but by river, a sprawling, interconnected web of waterways that stretched from the Baltic Sea deep into the heart of Russia and beyond. Swedish Vikings, in particular, mastered this route. They would sail their shallow draft longships across the Baltic, then drag them overland between river systems, a process called portage, to access the mighty Volga and Dnieper rivers. These were the superhighways of the medieval world, and the Vikings used them to travel thousands of miles into territories they called Garthariki, the realm of cities. They didn't just raid these lands, they settled and integrated, establishing trading posts that would eventually grow into powerful city-states like Novgorod and Kiev. The local Slavic peoples knew them as the Rus, a name derived from their rowing, and one that would eventually give its name to the entire country of Russia. From these bases, they pushed further south, their goal fixed on the two wealthiest cities on the planet, Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, and Baghdad, the dazzling heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. The evidence for this long-distance trade is not just historical, it's buried in the ground, and it's made of silver. All across Scandinavia, from the islands of Gotland to the fjords of Norway, hundreds of hoards have been unearthed containing hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver coins known as dirhams. These coins were the dollar of the medieval trading world, and the Vikings were absolutely obsessed with them. They valued the coins not for their face value, but for their pure silver content. Often, they were melted down to create ingots or into spectacular jewelry, like the massive silver neck rings worn by powerful chieftains as a mobile display of their wealth. The dates on these coins tell a vivid story. They begin to appear in the late 8th century, peak in the 10th century, and then abruptly stop around the year 1000. Precisely when the silver mines in the Islamic world began to dry up. This numismatic timeline perfectly maps the rise and fall of this incredible trade relationship. So what were these Norse traders offering in exchange for all this silver? Their cargo holds were filled with the prized natural resources of the north. Thick, luxurious furs from sable, marten, fox, and beaver were in incredibly high demand in the hot climates of the Middle East, where they were a stunning status symbol for the elite. Amber, that beautiful fossilized tree resin washed up on the Baltic shores, was crafted into beautiful beads and ornaments. They also traded honey, walrus ivory, and perhaps most grimly, slaves. The Viking slave trade was a brutal and foundational part of their economy. They would capture people during raids in Europe and the British Isles, then transport them east to be sold in the great slave markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. This human traffic provided a constant, horrifying currency that fueled their acquisition of luxury goods. Our most vivid window into this cross-cultural encounter comes not from a Viking, but from an Arab traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In the early 10th century, he was part of a diplomatic mission from the Caliph of Baghdad to the king of the Volga Bulgars, and it was there, on the banks of the Volga River, that he came face to face with the Rus. His account is a masterpiece of ethnographic writing, filled with a mixture of fascinated horror and bewildered admiration. He describes the Vikings as the perfect physical specimens, tall like palm trees, with ruddy skin and tattooed from fingernails to neck. He was both repulsed and impressed by their intense personal hygiene, noting their daily communal washing. He detailed their lavish cremation funerals, which included a human sacrifice, a practice that shocked his Muslim sensibilities. But most importantly, he described them first and foremost as merchants, meticulously observing their trading rituals, their haggling, and their temporary settlements on the riverbanks. Ibn Fadlan's account doesn't show mindless barbarians. It shows a complex, ritualistic, and highly organized trading society. What did the Vikings bring back with them from these epic journeys? The silver was the primary goal, the very foundation of their wealth. But they also returned with exquisite silks, fine glassware, intricate metalwork, and spices, tangible proof of contact with a world far more technologically and culturally advanced than their own. These goods didn't just make them rich, they elevated their status at home. A chieftain could display a piece of silk from Baghdad or a silver cup from Constantinople to demonstrate his global connections and immense power. This Eastern trade fundamentally reshaped Scandinavian society, fueling the economic engine that paid for the great longships, the magnificent jewelry, and the armies that would later reshape Europe. It reveals a Viking world that was deeply connected to the global economy, a northern frontier that was, in reality, a central hub in a network that stretched from the frozen coasts of Greenland to the bustling markets of the Middle East. And if their vast trade networks reveal a society of sophisticated merchants, a far more intimate secret shows us the Vikings not as warriors or traders, but as parents. We often picture a Viking childhood as harsh and short, a brutal training ground for the next generation of raiders, but archaeological discoveries paint a surprisingly tender and familiar picture. Viking children didn't just train for adulthood, they played, and the toys they left behind tell a heartfelt story about family, expectation, and the universal nature of childhood. The evidence comes from the most personal of places, the Viking home. Excavations of longhouses and farmsteads across Scandinavia have turned up a wonderful array of playthings, carefully carved from wood, bone, and antler. For boys, there were miniature weapons. These weren't the crude sticks you might imagine. Archaeologists have found expertly crafted wooden swords and small axes, shaped and balanced to mimic the real weapons their fathers carried. They were scaled down for a child's hand, but often showed signs of real wear and tear from enthusiastic play fighting in the yard. For girls, there were dolls. These were simple figures, sometimes just a piece of wood with a face carved into it, or a more elaborate doll with swatches of woolen cloth for clothing. Some even had tiny pieces of amber or colored glass for eyes. They also had miniature household items, small pottery bowls, tiny weaving swords for a pretend loom, and little carts. These weren't just toys, they were tiny mirrors of the adult world, reflecting the roles these children were expected to step into. The most sophisticated toy, however, was a board game that trained the mind, not the body. This was Nefertafel, often called the King's Table. It was a game of strategy and attack played on a checkered board with two unequal armies. One player controlled the king and his dozen defenders positioned in the center of the board. The other player controlled 24 attackers placed around the edges. The goal for the king's side was to escape to the edge of the board, while the attacker's goal was to capture him. This game was a direct reflection of Viking warfare, teaching core strategic concepts like flanking maneuvers, the importance of protecting a leader, and how to use numerical advantage. It was the medieval equivalent of a military simulation, and it wasn't just for adults. Game pieces and fragments of boards have been found in contexts that strongly suggest they were used by older children and teenagers, honing their tactical thinking long before they ever set foot on a battlefield. What does this all say about Viking childhood and family life? It completely dismantles the notion of a cold, emotionless society that viewed children as tiny adults. The care and craftsmanship put into these toys indicate that parents took pleasure in their children's happiness. A father carving a small sword for his son, or a mother stitching a dress for her daughter's doll, are acts of love and anticipation that any modern parent would instantly recognize. It shows that Viking society understood the importance of play as a form of learning. They didn't just command their children to work, they guided them through imitation and imaginative engagement. A boy playing with a wooden sword was practicing the footwork and coordination he would need as a warrior. A girl playing with a doll and miniature tools was learning the essential skills of homemaking and childcare. A teenager studying the board of Nefertafel was learning to think like a chieftain, to see the entire board and plan several moves ahead. This doesn't mean childhood was easy. Infant mortality was high and life was physically demanding from a young age. Children would have had real chores and responsibilities as soon as they were able. But the existence of these dedicated toys proves that there was also a recognized space for childhood, a time for play and development that was valued and nurtured. It reveals a society that, for all its famed ferocity, possessed a deep-seated concern for its future. They invested in their children not only through training and discipline, but through the simple, universal joy of a toy, proving that even 1,000 years ago, the laughter of a child at play was a sound worth cherishing. But for all the warmth and care within a Viking family, their society was built on a brutal and unsettling foundation that affected countless others. The Viking world, for all its exploration and trade, was fundamentally dependent on an institution we might not readily associate with them: slavery. This isn't a minor footnote, it was a core pillar of their economy and social structure. The Vikings practiced slavery on a staggering scale, and the lives of these enslaved people, known as thralls, were a dark and pervasive reality behind the glitter of silver and the glory of the sagas. Thralls were the engine of the Viking Age. They provided the manual labor that freed up freeborn men and women to pursue raiding, trading, and exploration. On a typical farm, thralls would handle the most back-breaking tasks: clearing land, tending crops, herding livestock, and chopping firewood. In the household, they would cook, clean, weave cloth, and care for children. They were property legally equivalent to livestock and could be bought, sold, traded, or given away at their owner's whim. Their value was precisely quantified. The Icelandic law code, the Gregars, states that a thrall was worth 12 ounces of silver, exactly the same value as a milk cow. Their existence was one of relentless toil and profound powerlessness, a stark contrast to the freedoms enjoyed by the landowning class. Where did all these thralls come from? A primary source was Viking raids themselves. While we focus on the stolen gold and silver, the most abundant and valuable treasure taken from monasteries, villages, and manors across Europe and the British Isles was human beings. A successful raid was measured not just in chests of coin, but in the number of captives driven in chains back to the longships. These people, torn from their homes in Ireland, Scotland, England, and France, would be transported to major slave markets. Dublin in Ireland and Hedeby in Denmark became massive hubs for this human traffic. From there, they could be sold locally to work on Scandinavian farms, or transported along the vast eastern trade routes to be sold in markets as far away as Constantinople and Baghdad, where they were exchanged for the Islamic silver dirhams that flooded into the north. The archaeological evidence for this practice is both silent and screaming. Thralls, being property, were rarely given formal burials. However, their presence is inferred in graves of the wealthy. The burial of the powerful Osberg queen in Norway included the skeletons of 2 other women who were likely her thralls, sacrificed to accompany her into the afterlife, a chilling testament to their status as disposable possessions. In some cases, excavations of farmsteads reveal smaller, cruder huts located away from the main longhouse, believed to be the dwellings of thralls. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes from outside the Viking world itself. In 2010, archaeologists working in Dorset, England, made a grim discovery: a mass grave containing 54 skeletons, all of them decapitated. Radiocarbon dating placed their deaths between the 10th and 11th centuries. An analysis suggested they were Scandinavian men. The leading theory is that these were a crew of Viking raiders who were themselves captured and executed. But another, equally plausible theory is that they were executed thralls. Their lives brutally ended as a display of power or as a punishment. The treatment of thralls was by all accounts harsh. They wore distinct, coarse clothing, often just simple tunics of undyed wool, and iron collars or rings have been found that were likely used to restrain them. The sagas, while fictionalized, are filled with casual violence against thralls, reflecting their low social standing. Yet, the system was not entirely rigid or without hope. It was possible for a thrall to be granted their freedom, becoming a freedman or leisingi. This could be earned through years of loyal service, purchased if they could somehow acquire the necessary silver, or granted as a reward for a specific act. However, freedom did not erase the past. Freedmen and their descendants carried a social stigma for generations and occupied a precarious middle rung in the social hierarchy, forever marked by their former enslavement. Understanding the scale of Viking slavery is crucial because it redefines our understanding of their entire society. The legendary Viking expeditions we've discussed, the settlement of Iceland, the colonization of Greenland, even the exploration of North America were made possible by slave labor. It was the thralls left behind to work the farms who produced the food and resources that sustained the explorers and warriors while they were away for years at a time. The vast wealth in silver that fueled the economy and elevated chieftains was acquired not only through trade but through the direct sale of human beings. This uncomfortable truth forces us to hold 2 contradictory ideas in our minds at once. The Vikings were indeed the innovative explorers, intrepid merchants, and loving parents we've uncovered, but they were also ruthless slavers whose economic miracle was built on the backs of countless unnamed, unwilling participants. Their story is not one of simple heroism or villainy, but a complex tapestry of breathtaking achievement woven with profound human suffering. Yet for all the brutality of their slave economy and the pragmatism of their daily lives, the Vikings cultivated a world of breathtaking beauty and intellectual complexity in a form you might not expect: their poetry. We often picture their longships cutting through waves or their axes glinting in battle, but one of their most prized and revered skills was not wielded with muscle but with words. The Vikings were master poets and storytellers, and their respect for a beautifully crafted verse was so profound that it was considered a skill worthy of the gods themselves. At the heart of this literary tradition was the skald, A skald was far more than just a poet. He was a historian, a journalist, a public relations expert, and a court entertainer all rolled into one. These were highly trained professionals who composed and recited intricate, complex verses known as drottfeet, or courtly meter. A skilled skald was a coveted asset to any king or chieftain. His job was to commemorate great battles, to praise his patron's generosity and courage, and to ensure that their deeds would be remembered for all time. A good skald could solidify a leader's legacy, while a satirical verse from a rival skald could damage his reputation irreparably. They were wordsmiths wielding a power as potent as any sword. The structure of their poetry was a marvel of intricate design, a verbal puzzle that demonstrated incredible mental agility. The drottfeet stanza was typically 8 lines long, with each line having a strict 6 syllables. But the real complexity lay in the alliteration and the use of kennings. Alliteration, where words in a line begin with the same sound, was the essential rhythmic engine of the verse. More fascinating still were the kennings, a sort of intellectual riddle or metaphorical shorthand that required the listener to be culturally literate to understand. A kenning is a compound phrase that describes something indirectly. The sea wasn't just the sea, it was the whale road. A battle was a storm of swords or a clashing of shields. A ship was a steed of the waves. A king was a breaker of rings, referring to the practice of breaking apart silver arm rings to reward followers. To compose a flowing, powerful stanza under these incredibly strict rules, while packing it with these clever, layered metaphors, was the mark of a true artistic genius. To truly hear the echo of a Viking hall, imagine the scene. The fire is roaring, the air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and ale, and the skald stands before the chieftain and his assembled warriors. He begins to recite, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the verse. Let's listen to a small, translated example, a praise poem for a king. The feeder of wolves, he felled the foe, the breaker of rings. His renown grows on the whale road. His will was law, the storm of swords his sword did draw. In just 4 lines, we get a sense of the power and the layers of meaning. The feeder of wolves is a kenning for a great warrior, as he leaves so many dead enemies that wolves feast upon them. The breaker of rings is the generous king. The whale road is the sea, and the storm of swords is the battle. This was more than entertainment. It was a living, breathing history lesson and a powerful reinforcement of the values that held their society together: courage, loyalty, generosity, and the relentless pursuit of fame. This rich oral tradition was the lifeblood of Viking culture for centuries, but it was in Iceland, long after the Viking Age had ended, that these stories were finally written down, preserving them for the world. In the quiet scriptoriums of Icelandic monasteries during the 12th and 13th centuries, scribes began to transcribe the great prose narratives we now know as the sagas of the Icelanders and the mythological poems of the Poetic Edda. These weren't dry historical records, they were sprawling, novelistic accounts of the settlement of Iceland, feuds between families, and incredible journeys. They preserved not only the events but the very soul of the Norse world, their legal disputes, their humor, their tragedies, and their deep connection to the stark, beautiful landscape they inhabited. The oral tradition was the perfect vehicle for a society of explorers and settlers. You can't carry a library on a longship, but you can carry 1,000 stories in your memory. The sagas and poems were a portable cultural archive, a way for families to maintain their identity and history across generations and vast distances. This reverence for the spoken word forces us to see the Viking world in a new dimension. They were not a culture of grunts and war cries. They were a culture that cherished narrative, that valued the precise and powerful turn of phrase, and that believed a well-told story was among the greatest treasures a person could possess. Their legacy is not just written in the rings of a tree they felled or the stones of a wall they built, but in the timeless, echoing power of a perfectly crafted verse. This mastery of both the poetic word and the harsh reality of the sea was made possible by one single defining innovation, their ship. The Viking longship is more than just an icon. It is a breathtaking piece of naval engineering, a machine so perfectly adapted to its environment that it allowed a people from the remote corners of Scandinavia to project their power and influence across the known world. To understand the Vikings, you must understand their ships, for the two are inseparable. At the heart of their shipbuilding genius was a technique known as clinker building or lapstrake. While much of Europe was building ships with smooth, carvel-planked hulls where the planks are laid edge to edge, Viking shipwrights took a radically different approach. They would first build the keel, the backbone of the ship. Then they would attach overlapping planks or strakes running from the keel upward. Each plank was riveted to the one below it with iron nails, the rivets clenched over on the inside to form a watertight, incredibly strong seal. This overlapping method created a hull that was not only immensely strong but also remarkably flexible. When a wave hit a clinker-built ship, the entire hull could twist and bend with the force, riding over the swell rather than fighting against it and risking splitting apart. This flexibility was the key to surviving the violent, unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic. The shape of the hull itself was a masterpiece of design. It was symmetrical at both ends, a feature that seems simple but was utterly revolutionary. It meant the ship could reverse direction instantly without having to turn around, a priceless advantage when navigating through icy fjords, narrow river systems, or making a hasty retreat from a hostile shore. Perhaps its most underrated feature was its incredibly shallow draft. A fully loaded longship needed less than 3 feet of water to float. This meant it could sail right up onto a beach for a lightning-fast raid, navigate the smallest rivers deep into the European interior, and travel far up shallow creeks to establish hidden camps. A Viking ship was the ultimate amphibious assault vehicle, giving its crew the element of surprise anywhere there was water, even just a few inches of it. Of course, not all Viking ships were created equal. They had a specific vessel for every purpose, a fleet of specialized tools. The most famous is the Dreki, or dragon ship, the classic longship designed for war and raiding. These were long, narrow, and built for speed and a large crew. They had a single, massive square sail woven from heavy wool and treated with animal fat to make it weatherproof, but their real power came from the oars. A large warship could have up to 30 pairs of oars, with each warrior responsible for his own. This allowed it to move with terrifying speed and precision, even in a dead calm. Then there was the Gnar, the workhorse of the Viking world. This was the cargo ship, the explorer's vessel. It was shorter, broader, and deeper than the longship, with a vast hold amidships to carry everything a colonist needed to start a new life: livestock, tools, timber, and families. It relied almost entirely on its sail for propulsion, though it had a few oars for maneuvering in tight spots. It was the Gnar that carried settlers to Iceland and Greenland, and it was a ship just like it that Leif Erikson would have sailed to Vinland. The most dramatic evidence of these ships doesn't come from sagas, but from the earth itself. In Norway, several spectacular burial mounds were found to contain entire ships, interred as grave markers for the most powerful kings and chieftains. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships, discovered over a century ago, gave us our first complete look at Viking shipbuilding mastery, but the story is still being written. In 2018, archaeologists in Norway, using ground-penetrating radar, made a stunning discovery at Gjellestad, the outline of a massive Viking ship buried in a farmer's field. This wasn't just any ship, it's one of the largest ever found. Excavations are ongoing, but this discovery proves there are still monumental finds waiting to be unearthed, each one adding a new chapter to our understanding of their naval technology. And then there were the dragon heads. The iconic prow ornaments we see on every longship were not always there. They were removable, and for a very specific and clever reason. The Vikings believed that these terrifying carvings, often with gaping jaws and fierce eyes, possessed protective power, warding off evil spirits during a voyage. But they also knew that bringing a dragon head onto shore could anger the land spirits or landvitir of a new country. So they would remove the head before landing, a practice that was so important it was actually written into Icelandic law. The law code, known as the Gregars, explicitly forbade approaching the island with a gaping dragon head on the prow, lest you frighten the native spirits and bring bad luck to the new settlement. This beautiful blend of superstition and practicality shows a culture that respected both the seen and the unseen forces of the world they were navigating. Their ship was more than wood and iron. It was a living part of their identity, their religion, and their greatest weapon in carving out a legacy that would endure for 1,000 years. This sophisticated maritime culture, with its complex social hierarchies and far-reaching trade networks, required a system of order to function, a set of rules that could manage disputes between powerful chieftains, regulate trade, and prevent society from collapsing into endless cycles of violence. And perhaps nowhere was this system more brilliantly realized than in Iceland, where the Vikings established one of the most unique and forward-thinking legal systems of the medieval world, all without a king, an army, or any central executive power to enforce it. At the heart of this system was the Althing, the National Assembly established in the year 930 at a dramatic natural amphitheater called Thingvellir, or Assembly Plains. This was not just a meeting, it was the culmination of a grassroots legal tradition brought from Norway. As settlers spread across Iceland, they established local assemblies or things, but the Althing was the first national parliament of its kind, predating the English Parliament by centuries. For 2 weeks every summer, thousands of people would make the arduous journey to Thingvellir. Chieftains, known as Garðar, would arrive with their entourages of free farmers. They set up temporary camps or búðir with colorful cloth walls, creating a bustling, vibrant tent city that was part political summit, part massive social gathering, and part grand national fair. The most important figure at this gathering was not a judge or a king, but a single man elected to a 3-year term, the lawspeaker or lögsögumaður. His role was absolutely critical and required a feat of memory that seems superhuman to us today. In a society without written legal codes, the entire body of law existed only in his mind. He was the living library of Iceland. At each Althing, he would ascend the law rock, Lögberg, a natural podium of stone, and recite 1/3 of the laws from memory. Over his 3-year term, he would recite the entire legal code, ensuring that every law was publicly proclaimed at least once so that no one could claim ignorance. He was also the chief legal consultant, the one who would be called upon to clarify the law in complex disputes. His power was immense, but it was purely the power of knowledge and respect. He had no army to back up his pronouncements. So how did this society, built on the honor of individuals, actually enforce its laws and settle its most bitter disputes? The system was a fascinating blend of public consensus and private enforcement. If you had a grievance against someone, say, a neighbor stole your livestock or a business deal went sour, you would bring your case before the court at the Althing. The courts were comprised of groups of chieftains who would hear evidence from both sides. Witnesses would give testimony, and the panel would then render a judgment. But here's the crucial part: the court had no power to physically enforce its verdict. It could only declare what the law was and who was in the right. The enforcement was entirely up to the winning party. This meant that justice was ultimately backed by the threat of violence and, more importantly, by the power of public opinion. A judgment from the Althing gave the winner the legal and moral right to seek compensation or retaliate. If the losing party refused to honor the judgment, to pay the owed silver for instance, they were effectively placing themselves outside the law. They would be declared an outlaw or skogangsmaður, literally a forest walker. This was one of the most severe punishments imaginable. An outlaw lost all his legal rights and protections. Anyone could hunt him down and kill him on sight without facing any penalty themselves. His property was forfeit, and he was condemned to a short, desperate life hiding in the wilderness. The fear of becoming an outlaw was a powerful incentive for most people to abide by the court's decisions. This system was specifically designed to manage the most destructive force in Viking society, the blood feud. The sagas are filled with epic, multi-generational feuds that began with a single insult or killing. The Icelandic legal system didn't try to eliminate the feud. Instead, it sought to regulate and codify it, to channel that primal desire for vengeance into a structured process that could prevent total societal collapse. The law provided a precise tariff for every injury, a system called wergild or man price. The price for killing a free man was different from the price for killing a slave. There was a set compensation for a lost arm, a lost eye, or even a specific number of stitches for a wound. By assigning a monetary value to honor, the system offered a pathway for the injured party to receive compensation and thereby renounce their right to take blood vengeance. It gave families a face-saving way to end a feud without appearing weak. The entire apparatus of the All-Thing, from the recitation of the law to the rendering of judgments, was a monumental effort to replace the chaos of violence with the order of law, proving that these so-called barbarians had a profound understanding of justice, community, and the delicate balance required to govern a society of fiercely independent individuals. But for all their sophisticated legal systems and poetic traditions, the Vikings were also masters of practical chemistry, turning even the most basic bodily function into a valuable resource. It may sound strange or even off-putting to our modern sensibilities, but for a Viking, urine was not waste. It was a crucial ingredient in two of their most important industries, cleaning and tanning. This seemingly crude practice was in fact a brilliant application of early chemistry that was common across many pre-industrial societies. The key to understanding this lies in a single chemical compound, ammonia. When urine is left to stand, the urea within it begins to break down, releasing ammonia gas. This ammonia is a powerful alkali, and the Vikings found incredibly clever uses for it. First and foremost, it was an exceptional cleaning agent. In a world without modern soaps and detergents, doing laundry was a monumental task, especially when dealing with the greasy, blood-stained woolens that were a staple of Viking life. They would collect urine in large vats and let it age, allowing the ammonia levels to rise. Then they would add the stale urine to a tub of water and soak the filthy garments in it. The ammonia would react with the greases and fats, saponifying them and turning them into a crude form of soap that could be rinsed away, leaving the woolens much cleaner and brighter. This method was so effective that it remained a common laundry practice in many parts of the world right up until the 19th century. The second, and perhaps more vital, use was in the tanning of leather. Transforming a raw, stiff animal hide into soft, supple, and durable leather is a complex process. After the hide was scraped clean of hair and flesh, it needed to be softened. This is where the urine vat came in. Tanners would soak the hides in large barrels filled with aged urine. The ammonia in the solution acted as a baiting agent, causing the fibers of the hide to swell and break down, making them much more receptive to the tanning agents that followed, which were often derived from tree bark. Without this ammonia treatment, the leather would have remained tough and inflexible, utterly useless for crafting the shoes, belts, armor straps, and saddles that were essential to daily Viking life. The archaeological evidence for this practice is unmistakable, though it requires a keen eye to interpret. At Viking Age workshop sites in trading centers like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden, archaeologists have uncovered large, sunken pits and barrels that were once lined with wood. Chemical analysis of the soil in these features often reveals unusually high concentrations of phosphates and nitrates, the chemical fingerprints left behind by the decomposition of organic matter, including urine. These are frequently found in close association with other telltale signs of tanning, such as piles of discarded animal horn cores and bones, and tools specifically used for scraping hides. The placement of these vats, typically on the outskirts of a settlement or downwind, also aligns with historical accounts of tanneries being situated away from main living areas due to the powerful odor produced by the process. This practice, while smart, certainly had its downsides. The smell of a tannery operation would have been overwhelmingly pungent, a mix of decaying organic matter and the sharp, eye-watering scent of ammonia. It's no wonder that tanning was often considered a low-status, though absolutely vital, profession. Yet this use of urine perfectly encapsulates the Viking ethos of resourcefulness and waste-not mentality. In a challenging environment where every material had to be used to its fullest potential, even human waste was transformed into a commodity that fueled their craftsmanship and hygiene. It's a powerful reminder that their ingenuity wasn't limited to grand voyages and epic poetry. It was also present in the smelly, unglamorous, but utterly essential chemistry of everyday survival. Yet for all their resourcefulness in tanning and cleaning, the fuel that powered the Viking body was every bit as sophisticated and varied as their technology. The popular image of a Viking feast might be a haunch of roasted meat and a horn of ale, but the reality of their daily diet was far more diverse, nutritious, and healthy than that of most other Europeans at the time, providing the foundational strength for their legendary endurance and physical prowess. Our knowledge of what filled a Viking bowl comes from two remarkable sources: their garbage and their graves. Across Viking settlements, archaeologists excavate midden heaps, ancient trash piles, that contain a treasure trove of food waste. These are not just random piles of bones, they are historical archives. By carefully sifting through these layers of discarded shells, animal bones, and plant remains, scientists can build a detailed picture of their daily meals. Even more intimate are the discoveries from bog bodies and well-preserved graves, where the actual stomach contents of individuals have been analyzed, providing a literal snapshot of a person's last meal. This combined evidence reveals a diet built on a surprising three-pillar system: the sea, the field, and the forest. The first and most crucial pillar was the sea. Living in a world defined by coastlines and fjords, Vikings were master fishermen. Their middens are overflowing with the bones of cod, herring, haddock, and salmon. They also harvested the bounty of the shore, collecting mussels, oysters, and clams by the basketful. This incredible access to fish provided a constant, reliable source of high-quality protein and, crucially, essential fatty acids and vitamins that were often lacking in landlocked diets. This seafood-rich diet would have contributed significantly to their overall health, reducing inflammation and supporting brain function, but they didn't just eat it fresh. They were masters of preservation, air-drying cod into stockfish on large wooden racks or fermenting Greenland shark into the pungent delicacy known as hakal, preservation techniques that ensured a protein-rich food supply through the long, harsh winters. The second pillar was the farm. Contrary to the raider image, the vast majority of Vikings were farmers. They cultivated barley, rye, and oats, which were the true staples of their diet. These grains were most commonly turned into a thick, hearty porridge, often enriched with a handful of peas or beans for extra protein. They also baked flatbreads on iron griddles over the fire. Their fields provided not only grain but also crucial vegetables like cabbages, onions, peas, beans, and carrots. Livestock was equally important. While a family might not slaughter a prized cow or pig every day, they did keep them for dairy. Milk, buttermilk, skyr, a thick, yogurt-like cheese, and butter were daily sources of fat and protein. Meat, primarily from sheep, goats, and pigs, was more common than beef and was often preserved by smoking, salting, or drying to create jerky for the winter months or for taking on long voyages. The third and often overlooked pillar was the wild landscape. Vikings were expert foragers, and their diet was seasonally enriched by nature's pantry. They gathered a wide array of berries, bilberries, cloudberries, raspberries, and strawberries, which provided vital vitamins and sweetness. They collected nuts like hazelnuts, and mushrooms were a common addition to stews. Wild greens such as sorrel, nettles, and dill were used both for flavor and for their nutritional value. This connection to the wild not only diversified their diet but also provided important medicinal plants, showing a deep understanding of their ecosystem. What truly astonishes, however, is the evidence of their reach found in their food. In the layers of high-status Viking settlements, archaeologists have found something entirely unexpected: the seeds of grapes and the remains of walnut shells. These items do not grow anywhere in Scandinavia. They are imports brought back from their travels and trade missions in the warmer climates of Francia and the Mediterranean. This means that a wealthy Viking chieftain in Norway could, on a special occasion, enjoy a glass of wine from Germany and eat walnuts from Constantinople. These exotic luxuries were powerful status symbols, demonstrating his wealth and his connections to the wider world, proving that their culinary horizons were as expansive as their geographic ones. The result of this diverse and balanced diet was a population that was, on average, healthier, taller, and stronger than many of their European contemporaries. Analysis of Viking skeletal remains shows less evidence of malnutrition and certain vitamin deficiencies common in other medieval populations. They had strong bones and good teeth, with surprisingly low rates of cavities compared to later periods when sugar became more common. This robust health was their ultimate advantage. It provided the caloric energy and physical resilience needed to row a longship for days, survive a grueling winter, endure the hardships of a campaign, and recover from wounds that would have killed a weaker person. The Viking warrior, often depicted as a brute, was in fact a finely tuned athlete, and his engine was powered by a diet that was centuries ahead of its time in its balance and nutritional wisdom. But even with their strong teeth and robust health, the Vikings had a surprising relationship with their smiles, one that went far beyond simple hygiene. We've seen their grooming kits and combs, evidence of a culture that cared deeply about appearance. But for some, that care extended to a practice that seems unthinkably radical to us today: the purposeful, painful, and permanent filing of their own teeth. This is not a myth or a guess. It's a startling archaeological fact that reveals a layer of Viking identity we are only beginning to understand. The evidence was unearthed from a mass grave in Dorset, England, a site we mentioned earlier in the context of a possible execution. Among the skeletons of these Scandinavian men, archaeologists made a bizarre and macabre discovery. On the front teeth of several individuals, specifically the upper incisors, were deep, horizontal grooves. These weren't the result of decay or damage from chewing on hard objects. They were too uniform, too precise. They were clearly filed into the enamel by human hands. This wasn't an isolated case. Similar modified teeth have since been found at other Viking Age sites in Sweden and Denmark, confirming that this was a deliberate cultural practice, not the odd behavior of a single individual. The immediate question is, of course, how on earth did they do this? We're talking about permanently altering the hardest substance in the human body, enamel, without the benefit of modern dental drills or anesthetics. The most likely method was as straightforward as it is agonizing to imagine. A skilled individual, perhaps a kind of early body modification artist, would have used a small, sharp file or a graver, a fine pointed chisel made of iron, and literally carved these grooves into the teeth. The person undergoing the procedure would have had to be held still, likely biting down on a piece of wood or leather to stifle their cries. The process would have been excruciating, exposing the sensitive dentin layer underneath the enamel and leaving the teeth permanently vulnerable to decay and extreme sensitivity to hot and cold. The very fact that someone was willing to endure this tells us that the meaning behind these grooves was incredibly powerful. So why would anyone subject themselves to this? The leading theory points directly to status and group identity. In many cultures throughout history, body modification has been a powerful way to signal belonging to a specific group, to mark a rite of passage, or to display one's bravery and ability to withstand pain. The patterns found on the teeth are not random scratches, they are consistent, deliberate designs. It's possible that a specific pattern identified a person as a member of a particular warrior band, a trades guild, or even a specific family line. It was a permanent, unremovable badge of honor that you carried with you everywhere, a mark that would have been clearly visible when you spoke, laughed, or shouted a battle cry. For a warrior culture that placed immense value on reputation and visual displays of courage, what could be a more powerful statement than enduring a procedure this painful for the sake of your identity? It was the ultimate proof of one's toughness, a declaration etched directly into your smile. This practice also forces us to see the Vikings not as an isolated oddity, but as part of a much wider human tradition of dental modification. From the ancient Mayans who inlaid their teeth with jade and turquoise to signify wealth and connection to the gods, to various Southeast Asian and African cultures that still practice tooth filing as a rite of passage into adulthood, altering teeth is a globally recognized form of expression. For the Vikings, it may have been a way to distinguish themselves from the peoples they encountered and raided. In England, where most men would have had natural, unmodified teeth, a smile full of horizontal grooves would have been terrifying and alien, a deliberate mark of the other meant to intimidate and demoralize. It was psychological warfare written in enamel. This small, strange detail opens a window into the Viking mind that artifacts of war and trade cannot. It shows a society deeply concerned with symbolism and identity, willing to endure significant personal pain for the sake of a visual statement. It moves us beyond the idea of them as simple brutes and reveals a complex culture with its own concepts of beauty, belonging, and status concepts so important they were literally carved into the bone. The filed teeth are a silent grimace of a message from the past, telling us that for a Viking, even a smile could be a weapon and a declaration of who they were. And if their earthly lives were marked by such distinct personal choices, their beliefs about what came next were equally rich and varied, offering not just one, but a multitude of destinations for the soul. We often simplify the Viking afterlife into a single, glorious hall for warriors, but Norse mythology presented a complex cosmology with different realms for different kinds of people, each reflecting a unique aspect of their worldview and the values they held most dear. The most famous of these realms is, of course, Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. This was the majestic hall of Odin, the All-Father, located in Asgard, the realm of the gods. But entry into Valhalla was not granted to just anyone who died bravely. The soul ticket was a very specific kind of death, falling in battle, weapon in hand. Even then, you weren't automatically admitted. The myth tells that the Valkyries, Odin's fierce shield maidens, would descend to the battlefield to choose only the most heroic and deserving of the slain. These chosen Einherjar would then be brought to Valhalla, where their afterlife was a perpetual cycle of a warrior's ideal day. They would spend their days fighting each other in glorious, fatal combat on the vast fields outside the hall, only to be resurrected each evening, their wounds miraculously healed. Then they would feast through the night on the meat of the magical boar Sihrimnir, which regenerated every day, and drink endless mead from the udders of the goat Hythran. This entire existence was preparation for the final, apocalyptic battle of Ragnarok, where the Einherjar would march out alongside the gods to face the giants and monsters of chaos. Valhalla was not about rest, it was about eternal readiness, a perpetual boot camp for the end of the world. But Valhalla was not the only option for those who died in combat. The goddess Freyja, a powerful figure associated with love, fertility, and sorcery, also had her pick of the slain. The myths state that Freyja gets first choice of the battlefield dead, and those she selects go to her field, Folkvanga, or field of the army. While the stories are less detailed about what happens in Folkvanga, it is clearly another prestigious warrior's paradise, a place of honor that operated alongside Valhalla. This duality suggests that even in their conception of a glorious afterlife, the Vikings acknowledged different paths to honor, perhaps reflecting different loyalties to Odin, the god of rulers and ecstatic knowledge, versus Freyja, a goddess of a different, more earthy power. For the vast majority of people, however, a different fate awaited. Those who died of old age, sickness, or accident did not go to the golden halls of the gods. Instead, they made the journey to Helheim, often simply called Hell. This is crucial to understand. Helheim was not a place of punishment or torment like the Christian hell. It was simply the underworld, a neutral realm of the dead, ruled by the goddess Hel, who was the daughter of the trickster god Loki. The journey there was long and cold. The soul was believed to travel downward and northward, crossing a fearsome river of weapons and finally arriving at a high fence surrounding the hall. The description in the sagas paints it as a damp, misty, and cheerless place, but it was not a site of suffering. It was a reflection of the Norse understanding of death as an inevitable and natural part of existence, not a moral judgment. It was where one's ancestors resided, a vast, quiet waiting room for the souls of common farmers, traders, mothers, and children. This complex belief system directly dictated how the Vikings treated their dead, transforming burial practices from mere ritual into a critical final journey preparation. The goal was to equip the deceased with everything they would need for the specific afterlife they were destined for, and to ensure they could actually get there. For a high-ranking warrior bound for Valhalla, this meant a burial fit for a king. The most spectacular example is the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. An entire, majestic longship was dragged ashore, placed in a trench, and a wooden burial chamber was constructed on its deck. Inside, 2 women, one of exceptionally high status, perhaps a queen or a powerful vulva Ceres, were laid to rest. They were surrounded by an unimaginable treasure of grave goods, a beautifully carved wooden cart, 4 elaborately decorated sleighs, a bed, chests of personal belongings, and even farming tools and kitchen equipment. The ship itself was packed with provisions for the journey, apples, nuts, dried meat, and buckets of grain. To power the ship on its supernatural voyage, a team of 15 horses and several oxen were sacrificed and laid around the vessel. Finally, the entire structure was buried under a massive mound of earth and stone, sealing the dead inside their vessel for eternity. This was not just a display of wealth, it was a functional kit for the afterlife, providing transportation, sustenance, and status symbols for whatever realm the deceased was entering. For those not accorded a ship burial, cremation was another common practice, particularly associated with ensuring the soul's release from the body and its journey to the afterlife. A funeral pyre, often built on a symbolic boat-shaped stone setting, would consume the body and the goods placed with it. The smoke rising to the skies was seen as carrying the essence of the deceased upward, perhaps to the realms of the gods. The remains would then be collected and buried, sometimes in an urn, completing the transition. What these practices reveal is a profound and practical relationship with death. The Vikings did not see it as an end, but as a transition to another kind of existence. By providing ships, they ensured passage. By providing food, tools, and weapons, they ensured the deceased could continue their trade, their role, and their status in the next world. A warrior was buried with his axe to fight in Odin's army. A vulva was buried with her staff to practice her magic. A housewife was buried with her keys and weaving tools to manage her household. Their afterlife was a direct continuation of their earthly life, and their burial was the final, crucial act of provisioning for the longest and most important voyage they would ever undertake. This practical ingenuity extended even to how they moved across their frozen world during the long winters, transforming a simple necessity into what might be one of history's earliest forms of recreational sport. While we picture them mastering the waves, they were also masters of the ice, gliding across frozen rivers and lakes on a clever invention that speaks volumes about their resourcefulness: bone skates. Archaeological digs across Viking settlements in Sweden, Norway, and England have turned up hundreds of these simple yet effective tools. They weren't crafted from metal or intricately carved wood. They were made from the leg bones of large animals, typically horses or cattle. A craftsman would take the long, straight metacarpal or metatarsal bone from the lower leg, smooth it down, and flatten one side. Holes were then drilled into each end so that leather straps could be threaded through. A person would simply strap the bone directly to the sole of their leather boot, and with that, they were ready to glide. The process was a perfect example of the Viking waste-not philosophy, turning a common byproduct of their farming and hunting into a valuable tool for winter travel. But how did they actually move on these slippery bones? Without the sharp, metal edges of modern skates that allow for pushing and gliding, propulsion was achieved differently. Vikings used a single wooden pole, much like a punter uses in a Venetian gondola. They would hold the pole between their legs, plant it into the ice behind them, and push off, gliding forward on the smooth, polished bone surface. It was an efficient, if not particularly graceful, method for crossing large expanses of ice much faster than one could walk around them. This wasn't just for isolated individuals. Evidence suggests this was a common mode of winter transport, turning frozen waterways into seasonal highways that connected communities that might be isolated when the water was liquid. While the primary purpose was undoubtedly practical, saving time and energy on winter journeys, checking fishing nets under the ice, or quickly traversing a fjord, it is almost impossible to believe that it was only ever about utility. Imagine a group of Viking children, their chores done, strapping on these bone blades and pushing each other around on a frozen pond, laughing as they slid and tumbled. Or perhaps young adults racing each other, testing their balance and speed, turning travel into a competition. The very act of gliding, of feeling the wind on your face as you effortlessly shoot across a glassy surface, carries an inherent joy that transcends mere practicality. The Vikings, for all their famed seriousness, were a people who enjoyed games, sports, and feasts. It stretches credibility to think they never once used these skates for the simple, pure fun of it. This innovation also reveals their deep, intimate knowledge of their environment and their ability to adapt to its every challenge. They didn't just endure the harsh Scandinavian winters. They found clever ways to thrive within them, to bend the season's difficulties to their advantage. The bone skate is a humble object, but it represents a profound understanding of physics and material science. They identified a material that was naturally smooth, hard, and slick when polished against ice, and they engineered a simple but effective way to harness that property for human mobility. It was a solution born of close observation and quiet genius, showing that their brilliance wasn't confined to their ships alone, but was applied to every facet of their lives, from the epic to the everyday. While the bone skates reveal a culture adept at finding joy and utility in their harsh environment, this same spirit of practical ingenuity and communal cooperation shaped the very foundations of their society in a way that would have been utterly foreign to most of their European contemporaries. We often imagine the medieval world as a rigid pyramid of feudalism with an all-powerful king at the top, nobles beneath him, and a vast population of powerless serfs at the bottom, bound to the land with no voice or rights. The Viking world, particularly in its Icelandic and Norwegian heartlands, operated on a strikingly different principle. It was a society where power was not just inherited by divine right, but was constantly negotiated, earned, and validated by the consent of free men. To understand this, we need to look at the social structure, which was divided into three main classes. At the very bottom were the thralls, the enslaved people we discussed earlier who had no legal rights. But above them was the vast backbone of Viking society, the carls or freemen. This was not a small middle class, it was the majority. A carl was a farmer, a craftsman, a trader, or a warrior. Crucially, he owned his own land and his own weapons. This economic independence was the foundation of his political independence. He was not a serf tied to a lord's estate. He was his own man, answerable first and foremost to himself and his family. His ability to feed and defend himself meant he did not need to sell his freedom to a superior for protection. At the top were the jarls, the earls or chieftains. These were the wealthy elites who owned large estates, commanded large ships, and had many followers. But here's the critical difference: a jarl's power was not automatic. It was not enough to simply be born into a powerful family. His status was entirely dependent on the support of the carls who chose to follow him. This relationship was cemented through a reciprocal system of loyalty and generosity known as the hearth. A jarl would attract followers by being a good leader, successful in battle, wise in counsel, and most importantly, overwhelmingly generous. He was expected to share the wealth from raids and trade, bestowing gifts of silver, weapons, and land upon his men. In return, the carls pledged their loyalty and military service. This was not a one-way street of domination, it was a two-way contract. If a jarl became stingy, unsuccessful, or unjust, his followers were within their rights to simply leave and pledge their allegiance to a more worthy leader. This constant possibility of losing one's power base meant that jarls had to continually prove their worth and listen to the concerns of their men. It was a form of meritocracy operating within an aristocratic framework. The most powerful expression of this democratic spirit was the thing, or assembly. We touched on Iceland's Althing, but this institution was common throughout the Norse world. These were local and regional gatherings where all free men had the right to speak, to settle disputes, and to make laws. At the thing, a carl could bring a lawsuit against his neighbor or even against a powerful jarl. The cases were heard before a panel of judges selected from among the community, and decisions were made based on customary law that was recited from memory by the law speaker. The enforcement of these rulings relied on collective agreement and social pressure, but the principle remained: the law stood above any individual, even the most powerful chieftain. This system ensured that disputes were often settled through arbitration and legal process rather than instantly descending into bloody feuds, though those certainly happened when the system broke down. This stands in stark contrast to the feudal systems developing in places like England and France at the same time. There, a king granted land to a noble in exchange for military service. That noble then granted parcels of that land to knights, who in turn had peasants or serfs working it. The serfs were tied to the land, owed labor to their lord, and had no political voice. Power flowed strictly from the top down, cemented by oaths of fealty that were incredibly difficult to break. In the Viking world, power flowed from the bottom up. A jarl's authority was assembled piece by piece from the freely given loyalty of self-sufficient, armed landowners. This created a much more fluid and dynamic power structure, one that valued pragmatism and reputation over rigid birthright. It was this very system that fueled the Viking Age itself. It encouraged ambitious young men to seek their fortune through exploration and trade, knowing that success abroad could translate into prestige and influence back home, allowing them to rise within a society that was always willing to reward initiative and capability. Yet for all the structured order of their assemblies and the communal spirit of their bone skating, the Vikings also understood the raw, terrifying power of chaos, a power they learned to harness and unleash on the battlefield in the form of warriors who seemed to transcend the very limits of human endurance and fear. These were the berserkers and the Ulfhithnar, fighters who entered a state of such uncontrollable, trance-like fury that they became the stuff of legend, and their psychological impact was as calculated and devastating as any axe blow. The term berserker itself is wonderfully evocative, likely derived from one of two Old Norse phrases. It might mean bare shirt, suggesting warriors who fought without mail, clad only in the pelts of bears, their bodies seemingly as impervious to blows as the great beast itself. Or it could come from berserker, meaning bare shirt, again implying they fought without armor, their bare chests a defiant challenge to any foe. Alongside them were the Ulfhithnar, the wolf skins, warriors who cloaked themselves in the spirit of the wolf, another animal revered for its ferocity, pack mentality, and hunting prowess. Historical accounts, particularly in the sagas, describe these men as undergoing a profound physical and mental transformation before battle. Their bodies would shudder and swell. Their faces would contort, their eyes would glaze over, and they would begin to gnash their teeth and bite the rims of their shields, howling and roaring like the animals they emulated. They were said to feel no pain, to possess supernatural strength, and to be immune to fire and iron. In this state, they would charge into enemy lines alone or in small, frenzied groups, a whirlwind of indiscriminate violence that could shred a shield wall's cohesion in moments. The immediate question is how they achieved this state. Was it pure psychological conditioning, a form of self-induced hysteria, or was it aided by external substances? The most compelling theory points to a combination of both. Certain psychoactive plants were readily available in their environment and featured in Norse shamanic practices. One prime candidate is the humble fly agaric mushroom, with its iconic red cap and white spots. When ingested, its toxins can cause powerful dissociative effects, distortions of size and strength, and a numbing of the senses that could explain the legendary immunity to pain. Another possibility is a brew made from henbane or even alcohol consumed in massive, ritualistic quantities to lower inhibitions and fuel aggression. However, it's also highly plausible that many of these warriors were employing advanced techniques of psychological priming using chants, drumming, and intense visualization to work themselves into a euphoric, adrenaline-fueled state of flow and rage, not unlike the rituals used by other warrior cultures throughout history. This wasn't mindless frenzy, it was a controlled loss of control, a weaponization of the human fight or flight response. The true genius of deploying these warriors was not in their individual killing power, but in the sheer psychological terror they inflicted on the enemy. Imagine you are a Saxon levy standing in a shield wall on a beach, watching a Viking longship ground itself. Before the main force even disembarks, a handful of figures leap onto the sand. They are not forming up into ranks, they are shaking, foaming at the mouth, tearing at their own faces, and emitting unearthly growls. Then they charge directly into your disciplined lines, ignoring wounds that should drop a man, swinging their weapons with impossible force. Your carefully held formation begins to buckle not from strategic pressure, but from pure primal fear. The sight of these seemingly possessed, inhuman figures would be utterly demoralizing. It would break the morale of even seasoned troops, creating pockets of panic that the more disciplined Viking warriors following behind could exploit. The berserker was a tactical weapon of mass disruption, a living battering ram designed to smash the enemy's will to fight before the main battle had even truly begun. This practice, however, came with a tremendous cost, and it's one that eventually led to its own downfall. In the sagas, berserkers are often portrayed as uncontrollable, anti-social figures. Their fury did not conveniently switch off after the battle. They were dangerous to their own side, prone to violent outbursts in peacetime, and difficult to integrate back into a structured society. As Scandinavia began to Christianize and its kingdoms centralized under stronger royal authority, these bands of elite, unpredictable warriors became a liability. A king wanted a disciplined, obedient army, not a group of individualistic, drug-fueled loose cannons. laws began to appear specifically targeting berserkers, outlawing their rituals and banishing them from society. What began as a feared and respected institution on the fringes of the battlefield gradually faded into the realm of legend and folklore, a terrifying relic of a wilder, more primal age of warfare. Their legacy endures not as a historical fact we can fully prove, but as a powerful testament to the Viking understanding of the deepest, darkest corners of the human psyche and their willingness to venture into them to secure victory. While we marvel at the psychological extremes of the berserkers' fury and the communal structure of their assemblies, the Viking relationship with time itself reveals a society deeply attuned to the natural world's rhythms, operating on a calendar of remarkable sophistication. They didn't track the year with simple solar cycles or erratic lunar phases alone. They used a brilliant lunisolar system that blended the best of both, synchronizing the moon's cycles with the sun's journey to create a practical, living calendar that dictated the entire pace of their lives from the moment to plant a seed to the perfect time to launch a raid. At its core, the Viking year was divided into two primary seasons, not four. The first was summer, the summer half-year, which began around mid-April. This was the time of activity, of travel, of work. The second was Vetter, the winter half-year, starting around mid-October. This was a time of relative inward focus, of storytelling, of crafting, and of survival. Each of these halves was then split into lunar months. A full cycle of the moon, from new moon to new moon, defined a month or manatha. But because 12 lunar cycles only add up to about 354 days, 11 days short of a solar year, the Vikings faced the same problem as many ancient cultures. Their calendar would quickly fall out of sync with the seasons. Their ingenious solution was to simply add an extra intercalary month, a leap month, roughly every 3 years to reset the timing. This kept their festivals and farming schedules perfectly aligned with the solstices and equinoxes they observed so carefully. The months themselves weren't just numbered. Their names were poetic and practical descriptions of what was happening in the world during that time. The year began with Thori around mid-January, a time of freezing cold and deep winter, its name perhaps related to the god Thor or to the concept of dryness. This was followed by Goa, a month anticipating the slow return of life and light. But some of the most evocative names came later. Skurpla, likely in early summer, meant the vibrant one or the thriving one when the world was bursting with energy. Hayanir in late July or August was simply haymaking, the critical window for harvesting winter fodder for livestock. And Gormanu, the slaughter month or gutting month in late autumn, was the grim but necessary time when animals that couldn't be fed through the winter were butchered and preserved. Each name was a direct instruction, a cultural memo about what needed to be done to ensure the community's survival. This careful tracking of time culminated in their major festivals, which served as the anchor points of their year. The most important was Yule or Jol, a multi-day celebration that began on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. This was not a time of mourning the darkness, but a defiant celebration of the sun's return. It was a feast of hope where families gathered, sacrifices were made to the gods for a fertile year to come, and the Yule log burned brightly to symbolize light and life. Conversely, the summer solstice was marked by a celebration known today as Midsummer, though the Vikings likely called it something else. It was a time of immense power when the sun never fully set and the veil between the worlds was thought to be thin. Bonfires were lit to ward off spirits and to celebrate the peak of the sun's strength, ensuring a good harvest. For the average Viking farmer, this calendar was essential survival gear. It told him precisely when to sow his barley. Too early and a late frost could kill the shoots. Too late and the harvest wouldn't mature before the autumn rains. It told the fisherman when the herring would be running thickest in the fjords. And for the aspiring raider, the calendar was his strategic planning tool. The summer half-year, Summa, was nicknamed the Viking season for a reason. You would only launch a longship across the North Sea when the winter storms had passed and the seas were relatively calm, typically from April onwards. This gave you months to raid, trade, and explore before you had to make the dangerous return voyage home, ideally before the storms of Gormanuther and the onset of Veta made the ocean impassable. But how did an individual without a printed calendar hanging in their longhouse keep track of all this? They used a deceptively simple but brilliant tool, the primstav or calendar stick. This was usually a flat piece of wood, often carved from ash or oak, with the year's cycle etched into its sides. One edge was for the summer half, the other for the winter half. Rather than writing out the names of the months, they used a system of coded symbols and notches. A specific mark might represent the first day of summer, another might denote the feast of a particular god, and another could be a simple reminder to begin shearing sheep. It was a personalized, portable almanac, a physical manifestation of the year's rhythm that a farmer could carry in his belt, constantly consulting its etched wisdom to navigate the demands of the seasons. This intricate dance with the sun and moon shows a people who are not just passive inhabitants of their environment, but active, observant participants in its cycles, using their deep understanding of time itself to build, explore, and endure. But this culture of strategic thinking wasn't confined to the deck of a longship or the field of battle. It was also cultivated in moments of quiet concentration across a checkered board. For the Vikings, one of the most sophisticated tools for honing a tactical mind wasn't a weapon but a game. Forget chess. The classic strategy game of the Viking world was Nefertafel, often called the King's Table. This wasn't a simple pastime. It was a direct reflection of their worldview, a mental training ground that simulated the very essence of Viking warfare, politics, and survival. The game's design was an elegant model of asymmetric conflict. Two players faced each other with unequal forces and different objectives, mirroring the classic Viking scenario of a raiding party attacking a settled group. One player controlled the defenders, a king piece placed in the center of the board on a special square called the throne, surrounded by his 12 loyal Huskarls. Their goal was to help the king escape to the safety of the board's edge. The other player commanded a larger force of 24 attackers, positioned in 4 groups around the perimeter. Their sole aim was to capture the king, preventing his escape. The pieces all moved like rooks in chess, traveling orthogonally any number of empty squares. Capturing was achieved by flanking an opponent's piece between 2 of your own, a move that represented surrounding an enemy in battle. The king himself was a more powerful piece, requiring to be surrounded on all 4 sides to be captured. This simple rule set created a deeply complex and nuanced game of attack, defense, and feint. We know all this not from a single rulebook, but by piecing together clues from across the Norse world. Fragments of rules have been found scattered in various medieval texts, and the game's popularity is attested to by the sheer volume of archaeological finds. Beautiful game pieces carved from bone, antler, glass, amber, and even whale tooth have been discovered in graves and settlements from Ireland to the Ukraine. Some of the most stunning were found in the burial of a powerful woman in Birka, Sweden, buried alongside her gaming pieces as a symbol of her high status and strategic intellect. Complete boards are rarer, wood decays, but we have enough evidence from surviving stone boards and imprints on wood to know they were typically grids of 11 by 11 or 13 by 13 squares, with the distinctive central throne and corner starting points clearly marked. So how did this train a Viking mind? Playing Nefertafel was a masterclass in the core principles of their military strategy. The attacker learns the relentless pressure of a superior force, how to use their numbers to control the board, cut off escape routes, and gradually constrict the enemy's options. The defender learns the art of the shield wall, of positioning pieces to protect the king, of creating a stronghold and then breaking out of it at the critical moment. It taught players to think several moves ahead to anticipate the opponent's strategy and to understand the tactical value of every single piece on the board. For a young chieftain in training, mastering Hnefatafl was as important as mastering the axe. It was a safe environment to fail, to learn from mistakes, and to develop the cunning necessary to lead men in situations where a wrong decision meant real death. The game's asymmetry also reinforced a key societal concept. That strength was not always in numbers. A smaller, well-organized and strategically brilliant force could outmaneuver and defeat a larger, less disciplined one. Hnefatafl was more than a game. It was a dialogue about power, a meditation on conflict, and a crucial pillar in the education of every thinking Viking. Yet for all their strategic prowess in games and their meticulous tracking of the seasons, the Vikings expressed their deepest beliefs and highest status not only through action, but through a visual language of stunning complexity and symbolic power. We often picture their world in shades of grey and brown, all rough wood and cold iron, but nothing could be further from the truth. The Viking world was a riot of intricate color and dazzling design, where every surface was a potential canvas for an art style that evolved over centuries, telling a story of its own. This wasn't art for art's sake. It was a vital form of communication, a display of wealth, and a conduit for spiritual beliefs, transforming everyday objects into masterpieces. The development of Viking art is so distinct that historians have divided it into 6 successive styles, each with its own characteristics, and tracking their evolution is like watching an artistic conversation unfold over 400 years. It all begins with the Oseberg style, named after the fantastically carved ship buried in Norway around the year 834. This style is characterized by its gripping beasts. Look at any Oseberg carving and you'll see them sinuous, feline-looking creatures, their bodies woven into intricate patterns, but always with their paws gripping tightly onto the borders of the design or onto their own limbs. It's a style full of energy and tension, as if the beast is struggling against the frame that contains it. This style wasn't confined to grand ships. It adorned everything from ceremonial sleighs to the most personal of items, like the elegant wooden cart found in the Oseberg burial, every inch covered in a swirling, breathing menagerie. As the Viking Age progressed, so did their art. The Bora style, which emerged around the mid-9th century, takes the gripping beast and condenses it into a tighter, more symmetric knot. Alongside it appears a new motif, the ring chain pattern, a series of interlaced circles that show a clear influence from the cultures they encountered through trade and raid. But the most dramatic shift comes with the Jelling style, named after a small silver cup found in the royal burial mound of King Gorm the Old in Jelling, Denmark. Here, the animal begins to change. It becomes more elongated and ribbon-like, its body stretching out into graceful, looping curves that interlace with itself to form a perfectly balanced S-shaped figure. The creature is still recognizable, but it is becoming part of the pattern itself, a harmonious blend of form and decoration. This evolution reaches a spectacular crescendo with the Mammon style. A single, breathtaking artifact defines this phase, an iron axe head inlaid with silver wire found in a wealthy grave in Mammon, Denmark. On one side is a classic looping foliate pattern, but on the other is something entirely new, a large, proud bird, its chest puffed out, its body filled with intricate swirls and patterns. This is no longer a ribbon animal. It is a robust, powerful creature filled with a new sense of grandeur and energy. Some scholars believe this great bird is Gullinkambi, the rooster who will crow to signal the beginning of Ragnarok, infusing the art with deep mythological significance. The Ringerike style that follows amplifies this trend, using fine, sweeping lines and a characteristic tendril motif that grows from the creature's hips and shoulders, making the animals look as if they are bursting with vibrant vegetative life. The final, and for many the most beautiful, Viking art style is the urn style. Named after the carvings on the wooden stave church in Ørns, Norway, this is the style of an empire refined. All the chaotic energy of the earlier styles is distilled into a state of elegant, graceful simplicity. The compositions are open and airy, dominated by a single, elegant animal, often a sleek, snake-like creature with a slender head and a single eye, locked in a delicate struggle with itself. The lines are long, fluid, and incredibly precise, showcasing a master carver's confidence. The Ørn style represents the culmination of 4 centuries of artistic innovation. A final, sophisticated statement before the Viking Age gradually gave way to the Romanesque influences of medieval Europe. This art was never confined to a gallery. It was integrated into the very fabric of daily life and death. A wealthy Viking was literally covered in art. Elaborate brooches, often in the form of stylized animals, held up their cloaks. Their swords were inlaid with intricate patterns of silver and copper, and the scabbards were tipped with beautifully carved metal fittings. They ate with decorated antler spoons and drank from fine glass horn beakers imported from the Rhineland. But the most important canvas of all was the ship. The soaring, spiraling prow of a longship wasn't just a functional piece of wood. It was a terrifying sculpture, a dragon head carved with fierce eyes and flaring nostrils, designed to ward off evil sea spirits and strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. This was art as psychological warfare. Ultimately, Viking art was a language. The complexity and quality of the design spoke volumes about the owner's wealth and status. Only the most skilled, time-consuming craftsmanship could produce such pieces, and only the very richest could afford to commission them. But beyond status, the motifs themselves carried deep meaning. The interlacing beasts could represent the chaotic forces of nature being brought under control by human skill and order. The great birds and serpents were direct references to the myths that shaped their worldview, to the serpent Jörmungandr encircling the earth, to Odin's ravens Hugin and Munin, to the wolves that would devour the sun at Ragnarok. Wearing a brooch with a gripping beast wasn't just about looking good. It was a way of carrying a piece of that mythic power with you, of aligning yourself with the strength and cunning of the animal world. In a society that valued both fierce individuality and complex storytelling, their art was the perfect expression of who they were, a people of immense skill, profound belief, and a relentless drive to find beauty and meaning in a world of wood, metal, and stone. Imagine a Viking chieftain standing on a windswept cliff, not with a spear in hand, but with a leather gauntlet protecting his arm. Perched there, its eyes sharp and its feathers ruffled by the North Sea wind, is a hawk, a living, breathing symbol of power, precision, and a connection to the aristocracy of the wider world. This is falconry, and for the Vikings it was far more than a practical way to hunt. It was the ultimate status symbol, a sophisticated art form they adopted and mastered, proving their ability to operate among the elite courts of Europe and beyond. The evidence for this practice is not just found in sagas or carvings. It's buried in the ground, in the graves of the most powerful men and women. At sites across the Viking world, from Denmark to the British Isles, archaeologists have unearthed the remains of these majestic birds of prey, interred alongside their human companions. In one particularly telling grave from a 10th century estate in Yorkshire, England, a man was buried with his full falconry kit. The bones of a hawk, the small bronze bells that would have been attached to its legs to help locate it in dense brush, and the leather jesses, the straps used to tether the bird to the falconer's glove. These weren't casual pets, they were prized companions deemed important enough to accompany their master on the final journey into the afterlife, a clear signal that this skill was a core part of their identity. So how did a Viking go about training a creature of the wild to hunt for them? The process was a testament to patience, skill, and a deep understanding of animal behavior. They primarily used 2 types of birds: the larger, powerful goshawk, ideal for taking down big game like hares and even foxes in the dense forests, and the peregrine falcon, the fastest animal on the planet, capable of breathtaking aerial dives to strike down other birds in mid-flight. Training began by capturing a young bird from its nest or, more perilously, taking an adult from the wild. The falconer would then spend weeks in a process called manning, slowly acclimating the bird to human presence. They would keep it hooded to calm it, carry it on their glove for hours to build trust, and reward it with slivers of meat, building a bond of dependency. The goal was to create a partnership where the bird would willingly fly free, hunt its prey, and then return to the falconer's call and the promise of a reward. This wasn't domination, it was a fragile pact of mutual respect between human and hunter. But why go to all this trouble when a well-thrown spear or a set of snares could also put food on the table? The answer lies in the powerful symbolism. In the early medieval world, falconry was the pastime of kings, emperors, and the highest echelons of aristocracy. From the Carolingian courts of Francia to the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, hunting with birds was a visible declaration of wealth, leisure, and refined power. For a Viking chieftain, particularly one who had grown rich from raiding and trade, mastering this art was a way to signal that he was no longer just a coastal raider. He was a European nobleman, every bit the equal of the Frankish counts and Saxon earls he did business with. A well-trained hawk on your arm was the medieval equivalent of wearing a tailored suit or driving a luxury car. It was a non-verbal announcement of your elite status, your connections, and your sophisticated taste. It showed you moved in international circles and understood the customs of high society. This cultural adoption is brilliantly captured in the art they left behind. A small, intricate metalworking mold found in a jeweler's workshop at the trading town of Heimdalsfjord in Norway depicts a clear, unmistakable scene. A rider on horseback with a bird of prey sitting calmly on his raised fist. This tiny, functional object proves that the image of the falconer was a popular and recognizable motif, something a craftsman knew would be in demand. Even more telling are the numerous carved stone picture stones from the island of Gotland. These massive limestone monuments, often erected as memorials, are covered in elaborate scenes from mythology and daily life. Among the images of ships and battles, we sometimes find the figure of a man, often interpreted as Odin himself, accompanied by his twin ravens, Hygiene and Munin. While not falconry in the strict sense, this imagery reinforces the deep cultural connection between powerful figures and birds of prey, linking the practice to divine wisdom and oversight. The Vikings, ever the keen observers and adapters, didn't just imitate this foreign custom, they integrated it into their own social structure and economy. The demand for these trained birds created a lucrative trade. The best falcons, particularly the majestic white gyrfalcons from Greenland and Iceland, became incredibly valuable commodities, traded over vast distances as diplomatic gifts or sold for staggering sums of silver. The possession of such a bird immediately elevated the owner's standing. This practice reveals a crucial and often overlooked dimension of the Viking elite, their desire for sophistication. They weren't just content with silver arm rings and fine weapons. They cultivated an image of cultured power, embracing the most refined practices of the age to cement their place among the rulers of the world. The quiet, focused patience of the falconer, standing in a field with a bird on his arm, is a far cry from the roar of the berserker, but it was just as potent a statement of control and prestige in the complex tapestry of the Viking age. While their sunstone could pinpoint the sun's hidden position on an overcast day, it only gave them an east-west line. To truly conquer the open ocean, the Vikings needed a way to hold a steady latitude, to sail a straight line across the trackless sea for days or even weeks on end. Their solution was a brilliant piece of pragmatic astronomy and simple woodcraft known as latitude sailing, and it hinged on their ability to read the sun's shadow with extraordinary precision. The heart of this system was a tool modern archaeologists call a shadow board or sun compass. Imagine a flat, wooden disc, perhaps the size of a large dinner plate. In its very center was a small hole designed to hold a removable gnomon, a central pin that would cast a shadow. The true genius, however, was etched around the disc's edge, a series of precisely carved notches that formed a curved pattern. This wasn't a random decoration, it was a customized graph, a personal navigational chart for a specific time of year and a specific destination. A navigator would use this tool throughout the day. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadow cast by the central pin would shorten toward noon and then lengthen again in the afternoon. By carefully marking the tip of that shadow at different times on different days during a known voyage, he could map out the unique arc the shadow would trace for that particular latitude at that specific season. Once this calibration was complete, the board became a powerful navigational instrument. On a subsequent voyage, even if the sky was hazy, the navigator could set up his board, insert the gnomon, and wait. By observing where the tip of the shadow fell in relation to the pre-marked curve, he could determine if he was north or south of his intended latitude. If the shadow was longer than the curve indicated it should be, the sun was lower in the sky, meaning he was too far north. If the shadow was shorter, the sun was higher, meaning he had drifted too far south. His job was then simple: adjust his course east or west until the shadow perfectly matched the curve on the board. He was now locked onto his latitude line. He could then simply sail due west to reach Greenland or due east to return to Scandinavia, using the sun's daily path as his celestial guide rail across the ocean. This method of latitude sailing required a deep, ingrained knowledge of the sun's behavior. A skilled Leithsögumaður or pathfinder would have known the approximate height of the sun at noon for his home fjord throughout the year. He would know that to reach the known latitude of Iceland, he needed to sail west until the noon sun reached a certain memorized height above the horizon. He didn't need complex mathematics. He used his own hand and fingers as a measuring tool. By holding his hand at arm's length, he could gauge the sun's altitude in units roughly equivalent to degrees. This hands-on, experiential knowledge transformed the vast, empty sky into a familiar and readable map. The most compelling proof that this wasn't just a theoretical concept was unearthed in the ruins of a Viking Age farm at Narsarsuaq in Greenland. There, archaeologists found a fragment of a wooden disc with a central hole and a series of carefully carved notches along its edge. This artifact, known as the Unatok disc, is widely believed to be a sun compass. Scientific analysis has shown that the gnomon's shadow would have fallen perfectly along these notches on the spring and autumn equinoxes at that latitude, proving it was a functional, not a decorative, object. This humble piece of wood is a direct link to the minds of these ancient mariners, a physical testament to their celestial craftsmanship. This sun-shadow navigation didn't work in isolation. It was the central hub in a wheel of techniques. The sunstone gave them a bearing when the sun was obscured. The shadow board gave them their latitude once they could see the sun's arc. They also relied on profound environmental wisdom, reading the direction of the swell, observing the flight paths of birds returning to land, and noting changes in watercolor and the presence of specific seaweed. The shadow board was the technological centerpiece that brought all this sensory information into a coherent, actionable course, allowing them to venture into the oceanic void with a confidence that bordered on the supernatural. It was this combination of mythic tools and meticulous observation that turned the North Atlantic from an impenetrable barrier into a highway. But for all their skill in reading the sun and stars, their true power was forged not in the sky, but in the fire and smoke of the blacksmith's workshop. We've marveled at their ships and their navigation, but it was their revolutionary mastery over iron that put the axe in the raider's hand and the sword in the chieftain's grip. The Viking blacksmith was more than a craftsman. He was a semi-mythical figure, a wielder of elemental forces who could transform raw earth into legendary weapons, and his workshop was the engine room of the entire Viking Age. The heart of this operation was the forge itself, a surprisingly sophisticated setup for its time. A typical smithy was a simple, smoke-blackened building, often set apart from other structures due to the fire risk. Inside, the centerpiece was a stone hearth filled with burning charcoal. Air was forced into this fire through a set of bellows, usually made from leather and wood, operated by an apprentice to achieve the searing temperatures needed to work iron. The smith had at his disposal a variety of hammers, tongs, files, and anvils, some of which were simple, large stones, though the wealthiest smiths had proper iron block anvils imported from trading centers. The process was grueling. The smith would heat a billet of iron in the fire until it glowed a brilliant orange-yellow, then quickly transfer it to the anvil to be hammered, folded, and shaped before it cooled and became too brittle to work. This cycle of heating and hammering was repeated countless times, a relentless, rhythmic dance of fire and metal that required immense skill, strength, and an almost intuitive understanding of the material. The iron they used wasn't the pure, homogeneous metal we know today. Viking Age iron was produced in a bloomery furnace, a clay oven where iron ore was heated with charcoal. The chemical reaction produced a spongy, glowing mass called a bloom, which was full of impurities called slag. This raw bloom iron was inconsistent and brittle. The blacksmith's first and most crucial task was to purify it through folding and welding. He would hammer the hot bloom, literally beating the slag out of it, then fold it over upon itself and weld it shut with a hammer blow, trapping any remaining impurities inside. This process was repeated over and over, sometimes hundreds of times, creating hundreds of thin layers of purified iron. This technique, known as pattern welding, was the secret to the Viking sword's legendary strength and flexibility. A blade wasn't made from a single piece of metal, it was a composite masterpiece. The smith would twist rods of this purified iron together like a piece of rope, then hammer them into the core of the blade. This created a central spine that was incredibly tough and shock-absorbent, preventing the sword from snapping in the heat of battle. The cutting edges were then forged from pieces of harder, higher carbon steel and welded onto this flexible core. The final result was a blade of breathtaking complexity, a flexible, durable core married to razor-sharp, hard steel edges. When the finished blade was polished and etched with a mild acid, the twisted layers of metal would reveal a beautiful, swirling pattern like water flowing across the steel. This was the maker's mark, a visible guarantee of quality and a terrifying work of art. Yet even among these exceptional pattern-welded blades, one name stands out as a mystery that has baffled historians and metallurgists for centuries: Ulfbert. Around 170 swords dating from the 9th to the 11th centuries have been found scattered across Europe from Ireland to the Baltic states. What makes them unique is the inscription carved into their blades, +VLFB +T+. This was not a simple mark of ownership, it was a brand name, and it signified a weapon of unparalleled quality. When modern scientists analyzed the metallurgy of these swords, they were stunned. Ulfbert blades were made from a type of steel so pure and advanced it was centuries ahead of its time. This was crucible steel, a material with a much higher carbon content than any bloomery iron produced in Europe. The high carbon content made the steel incredibly hard, allowing it to take and hold a sharper edge than any contemporary weapon. But it also made the metal brittle, a problem the Ulfbert smith somehow solved, creating a blade that was both harder and less brittle than its rivals. In a clash of swords, a regular Viking blade might notch or bend, and Ulfbert would shear right through it. So where did this miraculous steel come from? The leading theory points thousands of miles to the east, to the heart of the Islamic world. The only known source of crucible steel of this quality during the Viking Age was in modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, where it was known as Damascus steel. This means the Ulfbert makers, whoever they were, had access to a vast international trade network that brought raw ingots of this premium material from the Middle East up the Volga trade route and into a Frankish or Rhineland workshop. The inscription itself, using the Latin alphabet and a Christian cross, suggests the smiths were likely based in the Frankish Empire, perhaps operating under the patronage of a monastery with the resources to fund such an expensive operation. The Ulfbert wasn't just a weapon, it was a status symbol of global reach, a literal fusion of Norse ambition, Frankish craftsmanship, and Middle Eastern material science. To own one was to announce that you were connected to the most advanced technological network on the planet. The creation of such a weapon was shrouded in ritual and superstition. The blacksmith working in his fire-lit forge was seen as a practitioner of magic, a man who could command the elements. The process of transforming dirt into a deadly, gleaming blade seemed alchemical. Sagas are filled with stories of swords imbued with luck, cursed blades that would never be sheathed until they killed a man, and magical weapons that could only be wielded by a specific hero. The smith wasn't just shaping metal, he was pouring his skill, his reputation, and perhaps even his spirit into the steel. When a chieftain received a new sword, it was more than a tool. It was a partner in his quest for glory, its patterned blade a captured tempest, its edge a promise of victory. This deep reverence for the smith's art shows a culture that understood true power wasn't just taken with brute force, but was carefully, skillfully, and reverently built from the ground up. After the rhythmic hammering of the blacksmith's forge faded, another sound would have risen from a Viking longhouse or echoed across a feasting hall, the sound of music. While we picture their world as one of clashing steel and crashing waves, it was also filled with melody and rhythm, a vital part of their culture that connected the spiritual to the everyday. The Vikings were not silent warriors, they were a musical people, and the instruments they left behind reveal a world rich with sound, from the haunting cry of a bone flute to the driving beat of a ceremonial drum. Our evidence comes from the most intimate of places, the graves and garbage heaps of Viking settlements. Among the most common finds are bone flutes or flutes made from animal bones. Crafters would take the leg bones of birds or small mammals, carefully drill a series of finger holes along their length, and sometimes even carve a mouthpiece. These weren't crude noisemakers, they were carefully tuned instruments. When a modern musician plays a replica, the sound is haunting and clear, capable of producing a simple, melancholic melody that feels both ancient and immediate. For a larger, richer sound, they turned to the lyre. This was a stringed instrument, a smaller, handheld ancestor of the harp. The most spectacular example was found in the royal burial ship at Gokstad, Norway, a beautifully crafted lyre made of maple wood with arms shaped like the head of a fierce animal. It would have had perhaps 6 or 7 strings made from animal gut, and when plucked with a plectrum, it would have produced a resonant, warm tone perfect for accompanying a poet's recitation. Then there were the drums. While no complete Viking drum has survived, we have their beaters' wooden sticks with carved, bulbous ends, and small frames that suggest they used handheld frame drums, likely covered with stretched animal skin. The sound would have been a deep, insistent pulse, the kind of rhythm that gets into your blood and compels your feet to move. Music was never just for entertainment. It was woven into the very fabric of their existence, serving 3 powerful purposes. Its most sacred role was in ritual and religion. During a sacrifice to the gods like Odin or Freyja, the atmosphere would have been charged with more than just prayer. The rhythmic beating of a drum, the eerie melody of a bone flute, and the chanting of voices would have been used to alter consciousness, to create a trance-like state that brought the community closer to the divine. For a Volva, a female seeress, music was an essential tool of her trade. The sagas describe her sitting on a high platform, surrounded by chanting women, as the rhythm and melody helped her enter a trance to see into the future. Music was the bridge between the human world and the world of the gods. Its second role was as the engine of memory and story. This is where the lyre truly shone. The Viking skald or poet was a historian and entertainer. As he recited the epic tales of gods and heroes, his long, complex verses, he wouldn't have spoken them, he would have sung or chanted them, using the lyre to provide a musical framework. The rhythm of the music helped him remember the thousands of lines of poetry, and the melody made the stories more engaging and emotionally powerful for his audience. A tale of a great battle became more thrilling with a driving rhythm. A tragic story of lost love became more poignant with a mournful tune. Music was the hard drive of their oral culture, the technology that preserved their history and values for generations. And finally, music was a part of daily life and pure communal joy. Imagine the end of a successful harvest or the launch of a new ship. The community would gather for a feast. After the food and drink were shared, the music would begin. Someone would bring out a flute, another would take up the lyre, and others would simply clap their hands or sing along. There would have been dancing, a way to physically express the joy and release of the moment. Even the most mundane tasks like weaving cloth or rowing a longship would have been accompanied by rhythmic work songs or chants to coordinate effort and pass the time. A rowing chant with its strong, simple beat would have synchronized the movements of 30 oars, turning individual effort into a single, powerful musical machine. So what did this music actually sound like? This is the great mystery. We have the instruments, but we have no written musical notation from the Viking Age. The melodies and rhythms died with the last player. However, we are not completely in the dark. Experimental archaeologists and musicians have taken these replica instruments and, using clues from the later musical traditions of Scandinavia and the broader Germanic world, have attempted reconstructions. The results are mesmerizing. The music feels both familiar and alien. It's often built on a drone, a single, sustained note from the lyre, over which a haunting melody is played on the flute. The rhythms are strong and primal, based on the natural pulses of the heart and feet. It's music that feels connected to the land itself, to the wind in the fjords, the creak of a longship, and the crash of the sea. Listening to it, you can almost feel the straw underfoot in a smoky longhouse, see the firelight dancing on the faces of the listeners, and understand that for the Vikings, music was not a separate art but the very sound of life itself, a vibrant thread in the tapestry of their world. While we've followed Viking traders deep into the Islamic world and explorers across the Atlantic, one of their most profound and lasting impacts was the foundation of a state that would shape the course of history for centuries to come: Russia. The very name of the world's largest nation is a direct legacy of these Norse adventurers, a secret that rewrites the origin story of an entire civilization. This chapter doesn't begin with a raid, but with a reluctant invitation. The story, as preserved in the Russian Primary Chronicle, a 12th century historical account compiled by monks in Kiev, tells of a crisis among the Slavic and Finnic tribes inhabiting the lands around Novgorod in the mid-9th century. Plagued by internal strife and unable to form a stable government, they reportedly reached a decision. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." And so they looked across the Baltic Sea to the land of the Rus, the Swedish Vikings, who are already well known as traders and occasional raiders along their rivers. The Chronicle records their appeal: "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come reign as princes and rule over us." In the year 862, according to this tradition, a chieftain named Rurik answered the call, arriving with his 2 brothers and his loyal retinue of warriors to establish order. He settled in Novgorod, the new city, laying the foundational stone for the first Russian state. Now, the Primary Chronicle was written centuries after these events, blending history, legend, and political propaganda to legitimize the ruling dynasty of its time. While we can't take its every word as absolute fact, archaeology provides compelling, physical evidence that powerfully supports its core narrative. Excavations at sites like Staraya Ladoga, a key trading post on the Volkhov River south of Novgorod, reveal a distinct cultural layer from the mid-9th century. Among the Slavic-style log houses, archaeologists have found unmistakably Scandinavian artifacts: bronze brooches of the type worn by Viking women, iron pendants in the shape of Thor's hammers, and runic inscriptions carved on bones. Most tellingly, they've uncovered the remains of long, narrow homes built in the classic Norse style, with internal roofs supporting posts and central hearths, sitting right alongside traditional Slavic semi-subterranean dwellings. This isn't evidence of a hostile takeover. It paints a picture of a growing, co-mingled community where Norse traders and warriors initially lived alongside, and then gradually integrated with the local Slavic population. Rurik's successors would dramatically expand this fledgling realm. Following his death, power passed to his kinsman, Oleg the Seer. In a move of immense strategic brilliance, Oleg traveled south along the Dnieper River, capturing the strategically vital city of Smolensk before setting his sights on an even greater prize, Kiev. The chronicle describes how he used cunning to take the city, which was then ruled by two other Varangian lords named Askold and Dyer. Hiding his warriors in boats, Oleg lured them out by pretending to be a mere merchant on a peaceful journey. When Askold and Dyer approached, his hidden forces sprang out, and Oleg reportedly declared, "You are not princes nor of princely stock, but I am of princely birth." He then had them killed and proclaimed himself the ruler of Kiev, famously declaring it shall be the mother of all Russian cities. This moment in the late 9th century marked the true birth of the Kievan Rus, a powerful state that controlled the vital trade route from the Baltic to the Black Sea, with a blended Norse-Slavic elite ruling over a predominantly Slavic population. This integration was not a one-way street. The Vikings, or Rus as they were known here, did not remain a separate, foreign ruling class for long. Within just a generation or two, they were fully assimilating into the local culture. They adopted Slavic language, customs, and names. Their leaders, like Rurik's son Igor and his famous wife Olga, bore Norse names, but their son, who would become a great ruler, was known by the Slavic name as Sviatoslav. This rapid assimilation shows that the Viking role was not one of sheer domination but of state-building catalyst. They provided the initial military organization, the administrative structure, and the international trade connections that unified disparate Slavic tribes into a single, powerful political entity. They became, for all intents and purposes, Russian. The legacy of this Viking genesis is etched into the very identity of the nation. The word Rus derived from the same root as the Finnish word for Sweden, Ruotsi, which itself likely comes from an Old Norse term for the men who row, became the name for the land and its people. The ruling dynasty founded by Rurik, the Rurikids, would go on to rule the various principalities of Rus for over 700 years, only ending with the death of Tsar Fedor I in the late 16th century. The archaeological and historical record reveals a complex process far richer than the simple stereotype of Viking raiders. It was a story of invitation, integration, and transformation, where ambitious Norse chieftains seized an opportunity to build something enduring, ultimately giving birth to the first Russian state and forever linking the history of Scandinavia with the vast destiny of the Slavic world. But the true power of a runestone went far beyond a simple epitaph. While they served as powerful memorials, these carved stones were also the legal documents, the public notices, and in some cases the magical wards of the Viking world. A runestone could be a last will and testament, carved in granite for all to see and impossible to contest. One stone from 11th century Sweden explicitly states, "This stone is placed in memory of Björn, he took this land before." This wasn't just a fond memory, it was a legal claim to property, a boundary marker meant to settle any future disputes over inheritance by making the deceased's ownership permanently public. Other stones record complex inheritance arrangements, detailing exactly which sons inherited which parts of a farm or which valuable items, ensuring that the family's wealth and land were distributed according to the law and the father's wishes, preventing the kinds of fratricidal feuds that the sagas tell us were all too common. In a society without centralized record-keeping, the runestone was the ultimate archive, a permanent court record etched into the landscape itself. For some, the purpose of these inscriptions delved into the realm of the supernatural, where the very act of writing was believed to channel hidden forces. The word rune itself is deeply connected to the Old Norse word run, meaning secret or mystery, and many Vikings believed that carving the right symbols in the right way could unleash or control these powers. We find stones that are less like monuments and more like permanent curses. One infamous example is the Björketorp runestone in Sweden, which bears a terrifying warning to any who might disturb the area. It reads, "I, master of the runes, conceal here runes of power. Incessantly plagued by maleficence, doomed to insidious death is he who breaks this monument." This was more than a threat, it was a spoken spell, its power activated and fixed in place by the carving, meant to protect a sacred site for eternity. Other runestones feature cryptic, magical symbols called Galdrastafir complex, bind runes created by combining several runic letters into a single, powerful sigil. These were not meant to be read phonetically, but to be seen and felt, their power emanating from their intricate, interlocking design. The complexity of interpreting these messages is compounded by the fact that Vikings loved a good puzzle. They developed elaborate runic codes, turning their alphabet into a cipher that could conceal a message from the uninitiated. One common system was the use of twig runes, where the main stave of a rune was replaced by a branch pointing in a specific direction to indicate a different letter. Another was the cipher rune, where each character was assigned a number, and the inscription became a string of numeric codes that had to be deciphered. These weren't just for fun, they added a layer of mystery and exclusivity to a message, perhaps to protect a magical spell from being misused or to mark the inscription as the work of a particularly skilled rune master. Decoding them today requires the same combination of linguistic skill and clever deduction that a cryptographer would use, and the process of decoding is never truly finished, as new discoveries constantly force us to rewrite what we thought we knew. In 21, a small runestone was found during an excavation of a grave near the town of Usby in Sweden. The stone was broken, and its inscription was short and initially baffling. After meticulous analysis, runologists interpreted it as reading, "After Hakon, the son of Erpir." This was a stunning conclusion because Erpir was one of the most famous and prolific rune carvers of the late Viking Age, known for his distinctive style and his signature on over 50 other runestones. Finding a new stone by a master like Erpir is like discovering a lost painting by a famous artist. It tells us more about his workshop, his travels, and his family. But perhaps the most dramatic modern find was the Rurk runestone, long known but continuously revealing new secrets. For over a century, scholars believed its incredibly long and complex inscription detailed tales of heroic kings and great battles. However, a radical new interpretation published in 2020 proposed that the stone is actually about something far more existential, a fear of a climate catastrophe. The theory suggests the text describes a series of events connected to a period of extreme cold and famine following a volcanic winter in the 6th century, a trauma that lived on in cultural memory. The stone, according to this reading, was an attempt to understand and rationalize this terrifying change in the natural world through the lens of myth and heroism. This ongoing scholarship proves that runestones are not static relics. They are conversations with the past that continue to evolve, challenging our assumptions and revealing that even their solid granite surfaces hold meanings we are still learning to read. But beyond the strategic mastery of Hnefatafl and the thunderous charge of the Berserker, the Viking world held a quieter, more tender secret. Within the smoky warmth of the longhouse, curled by the hearth or trotting at their master's heel, were beloved members of the family. The Vikings shared their lives and their homes with a wide array of animals, not merely as tools for labor, but as cherished companions whose bonds of loyalty and affection were profound enough to last into the afterlife. The most common and versatile of these companions was the dog. Viking dogs were far from a single breed. They were working animals shaped by purpose. For hunting in the dense Scandinavian forests, they prized large, powerful hounds, built like modern Irish wolfhounds, capable of bringing down elk and even bears. On the farm, a different type was essential: agile, intelligent herding dogs to manage sheep and cattle. These canines were partners in survival, their keen senses and loyalty providing both practical utility and protection. But their role transcended the purely functional. The depth of this bond is etched into the archaeological record with heartbreaking clarity. Across Scandinavia, numerous graves have been found where a dog has been carefully laid to rest alongside its human owner. In one poignant example from a grave in Sweden, an elderly man was buried with the complete skeleton of a dog placed lovingly at his feet, a faithful companion chosen to make the final journey with him, a clear signal that this relationship was viewed as eternal. Then there were the cats, whose role was as practical as it was passive. As prolific seafarers and traders who stored vast quantities of grain to survive the long winters, the Vikings had a serious problem with rodents. The solution arrived on their ships, likely from the Middle East or via trade with the Byzantine Empire: small, agile cats. These felines were invaluable pest controllers, protecting both food supplies and the very ropes and leather goods on board ships from being chewed through. But they, too, found a place in the home and the heart. Archaeologists find cat bones in Viking settlements with surprising frequency, and some show signs of having lived long lives, cared for beyond their mousing duties. This relationship may even have shaped the animal world we know today. The robust, long-haired Norwegian forest cat, a breed known for its thick, water-resistant coat and formidable size, is widely believed to be a direct descendant of these Viking-era mousers. These cats were perfectly adapted to the harsh Nordic climate, and their ancestors likely sailed on longships to new lands, earning their keep and stealing a few scraps of affection along the way. This evidence of care extends to more unexpected creatures as well. Beyond dogs and cats, finds from various sites include the remains of hawks and falcons, kept for the prestigious sport of falconry, and even horses. While horses were primarily beasts of burden, there are instances where a particularly favored horse was given a respectful burial, not simply disposed of. The consistent thread through all these finds is a clear sense of value and connection. These animals were not discarded, they were commemorated. The act of including a pet in a human burial is a profound cultural statement. It required a belief that the animal had a spirit, or at the very least, that the bond itself was so powerful it was worth expending valuable resources to maintain in the next world. This forces us to see the Viking home not as a cold, utilitarian space, but as a place where the bark of a dog, the purr of a cat, and the trusting presence of an animal were woven into the daily fabric of life, offering comfort, companionship, and a quiet loyalty that stood in stark contrast to the brutal demands of the world outside. Imagine speaking a language every day that is deeply woven with the words of your ancestors' greatest rivals. This is the hidden reality for every English speaker on the planet, because the Viking Age never truly ended. It simply faded into the very syllables and sentences we use to describe our world. When those Danish and Norwegian longships landed on English shores, they didn't just bring axes and ambition. They brought the raw materials of a linguistic revolution that would forever alter the grammar and vocabulary of the English language itself. The most direct evidence of this is found in the most common, foundational words we use without a second thought. Think about the world above you. The Old English word for the firmament was hieophan, which gives us our modern heaven, a term with a spiritual, lofty connotation. But the Vikings looked up and saw sky, a simple cloud-filled expanse, their practical, earth-bound term, sky, won out for describing the physical blue dome we see every day. Now think about the food you ate this morning. The Old English word was eg, but the Norse version was egg. It might seem like a tiny difference, but this was a major linguistic battle. For centuries, English manuscripts show both words in use, a grammatical clash of cultures happening on the breakfast table. Eventually, the Viking word, egg, cracked the old one completely. This pattern repeats everywhere. That tool in your kitchen drawer, the Old English was nif, but the Norse nifferauer, knife, sounded sharper and stuck. Even the opening in your wall isn't purely English. The Old English term was igtheal, literally eye hole, a painfully literal description. The Vikings brought with them vindauga, the wind eye, a term that was both practical and strangely poetic. We smoothed it down to window, but the soul of the word is entirely Norse. This wasn't just borrowing fancy terms. This was the language of conquest and cohabitation, replacing the most basic elements of everyday speech for the common Anglo-Saxon farmer living under the Danelaw. But the Viking signature on England isn't just heard, it's seen on the map itself. Take a drive through the countryside of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the East Midlands, the heart of the Danelaw, and you are literally reading a Norse map. Place names ending in by, like Grimsby or Whitby, are a dead giveaway. The Old Norse word byr simply means farm or settlement. Derby was Dioraby, the farm where deer are found. Then there's Thorp from the Norse Thorp, meaning outlying farmstead or village. Scunthorpe was simply Skuma's farm, and Kirk from the Norse Kirkja points to a settlement with a church, as in Ormskirk, the Church of Orma. These names weren't chosen by Anglo-Saxon scribes. They were what the Viking settlers called these places as they cleared land, built farms, and put down roots. They are frozen moments of history, administrative records of Norse land ownership and community building that have endured for over 1,000 years. Even the word for a low-lying meadow, logger, gives us the common suffix low, as in the archaeological site of Repton, where a mass grave of Vikings was found. This onomastic footprint is perhaps the most permanent Viking monument of all, more enduring than any runestone or burial mound. This profound linguistic blending reveals the most surprising secret of all. The relationship between Viking and Saxon was not one of simple extermination. You cannot force an entire population to change the most basic words in its vocabulary through violence alone. For these Norse terms to seep so deeply into the bedrock of English, there had to be sustained, intimate contact and a mutual need to communicate. Anglo-Saxon peasants and Norse settlers lived side by side, traded, intermarried, and raised bilingual children. In these mixed households, the languages collided and began to simplify. Old English was a highly inflected language, meaning it used complex case endings on its words to show their function in a sentence, much like modern German. Old Norse had a similar structure, but the two systems were just different enough to be confusing. To communicate, people started to drop the complicated endings and rely more on word order, a process that began the transformation of Old English into the much simpler Middle English. Furthermore, the Vikings gave us the incredibly useful third-person plural pronouns, they, them, and their. Old English used hi, him, and hiora, which were frustratingly similar to the singular pronouns he and him. The clear, distinct Norse pronouns ther, thime, thera were adopted to avoid confusion, providing a grammatical clarity we still benefit from today. This was not a hostile takeover of a language, it was a peaceful merger, a pragmatic solution forged in the fields, markets, and homes of a shared England. Every time we look at the sky, eat an egg, or tell someone what they are doing, we are speaking a language forged in the fires of cultural fusion, a living, breathing artifact of the Viking Age that is as alive today as it was 1,000 years ago. So as we've journeyed from the icy shores of Newfoundland to the bustling markets of Baghdad, we've uncovered a truth far more fascinating than the myth. The Vikings were not the one-dimensional barbarians of legend. They were meticulous navigators who used sunstones to sail across oceans, sophisticated traders who connected continents, and innovative lawmakers who built one of the world's first parliaments. They were parents who gifted their children toys, poets who revered the power of a well-crafted verse, and individuals who valued cleanliness and grooming in a way that put their European contemporaries to shame. We've met a female military commander buried with full honors in Burqa, explored their vast eastern trade routes that funneled Islamic silver into the north, and seen how their language and place names permanently shaped the map of England. Their story is a complex tapestry of brutal reality and breathtaking achievement, of profound tradition and incredible adaptability. It's a history not of mindless destruction, but of dynamic creation, exploration, and connection that forever changed the world. Now we want to hear from you. After uncovering these 30 secrets, which one completely reshaped your understanding of the Viking Age? Was it the truth about the helmets, the discovery of North America, or the powerful role of women? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's greatest mysteries, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten.